Chapter 631. Yesterday, when I was correcting a typo, I wailed loudly. My 2,000 subscribed friends didn't see it. In reality, I was just sighing at the headache of writing. P.S. Today is the 10th, greetings to everyone for monthly votes. Those who are happy, please throw me a few votes. Also, I will write an extra chapter in the next few days, but it is definitely not to explode for votes. There won't be too many words in a chapter. It is just to make up for the chapter 1 didn't write when I drank too much that day. I'm a lazy person. From the Emperor's cold and mocking gaze, Lily understood many things. Her heart immediately grew cold. Slowly lowering her head, she bit her plump lower lip and didn't say a word. The Northern Chi Emperor looked at her appearance. For some reason, a wave of anger surged in his heart. Through his teeth, he said in an icy voice, "Is this how you repay me?" The last 3 words rose in pitch. The eunuchs were all outside the little garden while the aces of the Sword Hut and Northern Chi had already surrounded the room. The Northern Chi Emperor was not worried that Fan Xian would be able to get close to his body. Lily raised her head and calmly replied, "Lily has not done anything wrong to you, Your Majesty." The Northern Chi Emperor's expression gradually became dark and cold. Pointing at her face, he said each word clearly, "What else do you want to do wrong to me? Do you want him to kill me for it to be right?" Without waiting for Lily to reply, he narrowed his eyes and said, "It's a pity that he is about to die." Hearing these words, Lily had long shaken off her earlier shock. She knew what kind of person Fan Xian was. Even though Sir Langtiao had brought a group of aces from the Sword Hut to subdue Fan Xian, he knew too many things. She looked at the Northern Chi Emperor with pity and quietly said, "Your Majesty, if I were you, I would let Fan Xian leave and capture him or try to kill him. Who knows what earth-shattering things he will do before he dies." The Northern Chi Emperor was slightly startled. He didn't understand what Lily meant by her words. A gust of wind suddenly blew through the little garden in the mountain residence. Amidst the swirling sand, a black and red figure came crashing down like a boulder in the wind. Its power was unstoppable as it ruthlessly smashed toward the Emperor's slightly thin and weak body. The little Emperor's pupils constricted. In that instant, he clearly saw who this person was. He was endlessly shocked. Could it be that even with his clever arrangements and the combined attack of Master Langtiao, Friar He, and the warriors of the Sword Hut had not been able to stop this person? In the blink of an eye, he was, after all, an emperor. Facing such a dangerous situation, he did not panic at all. With a roar, he drew his sword from his waist and slashed at the figure. With a clang, the knife and sword clashed. The black dagger easily broke through the Northern Chi Emperor's sword. The figure moved closer to the Northern Chi Emperor's embrace. Like a gust of wind entering the embrace of the forest, like a stone falling into the clear lake. It startled a group of pine trees and created layers of clear ripples. Fan Xian spat out a mouthful of fresh blood onto the little Emperor's body, drenching him with blood. Although the black dagger had easily broken through the Emperor's sword, this gentle touch caused him, at the end of his strength, to suffer great damage to his heart meridians. He sprayed out a sky full of blood. To be able to escape from the encirclement of 5 9th-level aces was not because Fan Xian had exceptional abilities. Rather, it was because when the eunuch had gone to summon Lily to see the Emperor, Fan Xian had seen a problem. Although he wasn't sure how the Northern Chi Emperor had guessed that there was someone in the room, he didn't have much time to think. Just as Lily had taken 2 steps away from the mountain residence, he had broken out of the encirclement and forcefully pushed aside Friar He's sinister attack and avoided the sword light and chill of the Sword Hut disciples. He had only been a moment ahead, but it was the most critical moment. On his escape route, he had run into Langtiao. If Langtiao had attacked outside the room, Fan Xian probably would not have had any chance to escape. Under the eaves, he had exchanged a blow with Lang Tiao. Fan Xian's body flew up diagonally. Lang Tiao's Xinqi had also been stimulated. His legs sank and he could not move for a moment. At that time, there were two paths in front of Fan Xian. One was up the mountain, and the other was toward the grass hut. Without question, the second path was more dangerous. Yun Jilan and the two disciples of the sword hut were still standing guard at the foot of the mountain. Once he fell into such a hopeless situation, even if Fan Xian had exceptional abilities, it would be difficult for him to survive. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian turned sharply in the air like a sparrow hawk. Drawing an arc, he charged straight toward the precipice of the mountain residence. Below the precipice was one of the holy lands of martial arts, the sword hut. Fan Xian had made such a risky choice because he was not satisfied. He was not satisfied that he had taken such a great risk and hadn't even seen Siga Jian's face. He hadn't even touched the Northern Qi Emperor's side. The heavens were indeed looking out for him. On his escape route, he ran into the little garden and saw the emperor dressed as a young master standing by the mountain gate. Fresh blood sprayed over the Northern Qi Emperor's head and face like it was free of charge. Fan Xian closed in on his body but was unable to stop his footsteps. He had forcefully escaped danger and had exchanged a blow with Lang Tiao along the way. He had truly reached his limit. It was impossible for him to pull back his feet. Under Sea Lily's terrified gaze, Fan Xian held the little emperor like two men committing suicide for love. Resolutely, and courageously, they fell down the precipice. A few streaks of light flashed past. With Lang Tiao in the lead, a number of aces passed by Sea Lily's side. With faces full of shock, they watched as Fan Xian held the little emperor and charged down the precipice with no regard for his life. Without even thinking, they followed him down. Fan Xian was not committing suicide. In this world, other than Uncle Wu Zhu, he was the only one who had turned jumping off cliffs into entertainment. Although he was heavily injured and held an important person in his arms, he still accurately found a foothold. Whether it was a protruding rock or a sunken hole in the grass, he was like a wooden man with springs installed. He kicked up a trail of dust on the precipitous precipice. In an instant, he had landed on the flat ground below the precipice. The speed of his fall was very fast. The rebound was great. A trickle of blood seeped out of the corner of Fan Xian's lips again. The Northern Qi Emperor, who had been forcefully restrained by him, was shaken to the core. His face was pale. Even so, there was still not a glimmer of fear in the emperor's eyes. He only stared coldly into Fan Xian's eyes with slight confusion. It was as if he had not thought that Fan Xian would not only be able to escape but also restrain him. The flat ground below the precipice was in front of the sword hut. A strange change occurred. The disciples of the sword hut, who had been forcefully preventing 13th Wang from entering the sword hut, drew their swords from their waists and quickly formed a sword formation, surrounding Fan Xian in the center. Not far away, Yun Jilan, who had been hiding in the dark and had not shown himself, finally walked out. Sword intent shot into the sky and pierced toward Fan Xian. A number of gray shadows flashed past the precipice. With Lang Tiao in the lead, the aces were only a moment slower than Fan Xian. They stepped onto the rocks and followed. The scene immediately sank into silence. The silence contained boundless nervousness. Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor's pulse with one hand and gripped the black dagger tightly with the other. His eyes watched his surroundings cautiously. He only needed a faint glance to know that all of the 9th-level aces in the world, particularly those from Northern Qi and Dongyi, had basically gathered here. Ever since the Battle of Dong Mountain, probably only the Sword Hut could gather so many powerful warriors. These people's goal was the same. It was simple, to keep Fan Xian here. The problem was that Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor's hand in his hand. Although his grip was gentle, everyone knew that if he wanted to, the strange tyrannical Jinqi in his body could immediately turn the Northern Qi Emperor into countless balls of flesh and blood. To be able to suppress the Emperor while surrounded by so many aces, he is indeed worthy of being the Qin Kingdom's Fan Xian. Someone looked at this scene and sighed in admiration in a quiet voice. The person who spoke was the second disciple of the Sword Hut. At this moment, everyone was in a nervous mood. Only this second disciple, who did not belong to either side, could so naturally sigh and say what everyone wanted to say in their hearts. Although everyone in the world knew that Commissioner Fan was already a top 9th level ace, it was clearly the Northern Qi Emperor who had grasped his tracks and arranged an ambush in the mountain residence. Unexpectedly, he had escaped and held the Emperor hostage. Regardless of whether it was Friar He or the aces of the Sword Hut, in a one-on-one situation, even if they were no match for Fan Xian, they could at least bring him a great deal of trouble. Furthermore, in the mountain residence, there was still Sir Lang Tiao, whose strength was not below Fan Xian's. Even in such a situation, they were still unable to keep Fan Xian. Everyone present felt a chill in their hearts. They wondered if Fan Xian had had some strange encounter these 2 years to become so powerful. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and coughed. Holding the little emperor's hand tightly, he looked around and said in a raspy voice, "So, everyone is here. Can we talk properly now?" The Sword Hut was on the outskirts of Dongyi. The concave grass hut stood against the mountain and took up a large amount of space. The door to the grass hut was at the bottom of the cliff. Sigurd and the other disciples were in seclusion in the depths of the grass hut. At this moment, a dozen aces had gathered in front of the Sword Hut. They should not have disturbed the important figures in the depths of the Sword Hut. Fan Xian knew he was not powerful. One powerful Lang Tiao was enough to hold him back. Furthermore, outside the crowd, Yunjilan was gradually gathering sword intent as he stared at him. These two were both top 9th level aces who had been famous for a long time. The reason he had been able to escape from the mountain residence earlier was completely because of his wild beast sense of danger and valiant decisiveness. As for capturing the Northern Qi Emperor in the end, it was all thanks to his luck. If he had not surprised everyone by charging valiantly toward the Sword Hut at the bottom of the cliff, he would not have encountered the Northern Qi Emperor. The key to success was power, decisiveness, luck, and the courage that Fan Xian had lacked the most in the past. Although he had already subdued the Northern Qi Emperor, the situation was still dangerous. Regardless of who it was, no one would be able to escape the encirclement of these aces. Success. It was still too early. He had only just started on his way. What he was on was a dangerous path filled with brambles and small blood-soaked flowers. The Northern Qi Emperor stood by his side and looked coldly at the man beside him. Even in such a dangerous situation, his expression did not change. He couldn't help but feel some admiration. Slowly, he said, "Fan Xian, you are very daring to offend me in front of the Sword Hut." Fan Xian raised his wrist and wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips. Self-mockingly, he said, "Your Majesty wants to kill me. Do I have to stretch out my neck and wait to be executed?" He raised his head, squinted at his surroundings, and said, "Although I don't want to do something as unskilled as kidnapping, you actually found me so quickly, and your luck is bad enough to be caught by me, so I can only be a kidnapper." He raised his voice and smiled slightly at the gradually approaching crowd. "To put it crudely, if you want him to live, don't force me. Don't force me to act out." After these words were said, everyone fell silent. Yunjilan slowly separated the group and raised his hands in a greeting toward Fan Xian. In a quiet voice, he said, "Sir Fan Jr., you alone have caused trouble for the Sword Hut. I, Yunjilan, cannot help but admire you. However, even if you have subdued the Emperor, this place is still the sword hut. Do you expect me to let you leave? At this moment, Lang Tiao also walked forward and bowed to Fan Xian. Sir Fan Jr., I admire your courage and strength. However, with so many heroes gathered here, even if you have extraordinary abilities, you will not be able to escape unscathed. As for the Emperor, of course, we cannot let you take him away. Fan Xian forcefully swallowed the blood surging up. Raising his brows, his expression became fierce. I can't beat you. If you are not willing to let me go, I don't mind having someone go with me. Remember to arrange a grave together. I want to leave a glorious mark in history. Encountering such a seemingly unreasonable, rude, and shameless warrior who was actually sinister to the extreme and who no one knew what he had up his sleeves, Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan both felt troubled. Yun Jilan glanced at Lang Tiao. He seemed to be confused. Since they had discovered Fan Xian's existence in the mountain residence, given his cultivation and the help of a few aces, how could he still escape and even capture the Qi Emperor as a hostage? Lang Tiao's heart was filled with sadness and anger. How could he have thought that Fan Xian, surrounded and attacked by so many people, would walk right into the trap and run toward the sword hut? Who would have thought that at that time, the Emperor would be watching the sword hut in a daze? The sword hut was shocked by the power Fan Xian had displayed. They couldn't help but feel eager. They wanted to see just what the limits of the leading young aces of the Qin kingdom were. However, the northern Qi aces were terrified. They were terrified that if Fan Xian was careless or his mood suddenly turned bad, he would hurt the Emperor. Just as the situation reached an impasse, the northern Qi Emperor, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly said, Fan Xian, don't scare these pitiful people. You wouldn't dare to touch a finger of mine. Fan Xian turned his head and saw the little Emperor looking at him with a mocking gaze. For some reason, he was angered by this gaze. Smiling mockingly, he stretched out 2 fingers and lifted the little Emperor's chin. Disdainfully, he said, Little thing, your chin is pretty slippery. The entire scene burst into an uproar. No one had thought that Fan Xian would do such a frivolous thing to the ruler of a country. Then, they heard Fan Xian's next words and said, I wouldn't dare to touch a finger of yours. How about 2? I swear on my teacher's name that if you let the Emperor go, we will not stop you, Lang Tiao suddenly said in a cold voice as he took a step forward. Wind rose from nowhere and his aura exploded. Given his position, this oath was, without a doubt, giving Fan Xian an excellent opportunity to retreat. However, Fan Xian did not want to retreat at all. Other than Fan Xian, no one else dared to be so daring to not retreat in the face of the threat of so many aces. Instead, he wanted to seek more benefits. If you don't stop me, what about the people of the sword hut? Fan Xian asked as he looked at Lang Tiao. Lang Tiao glanced at Yun Jilan. Yun Jilan closed his eyes for a moment and then quietly said, The disciples of the sword hut will not stop you. However, once you walk half a li out of the sword hut, they will begin to chase after you. Fan Xian looked at him and smiled mockingly. Turning his head, he said to Lang Tiao, You heard it. I don't want to be chased after. Lang Tiao angrily said, Then, what exactly do you want to do? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. His gaze suddenly turned to the continuous grass hut not far away. His gaze gradually lowered and swept across 13th Wang, who seemed to have been forgotten by everyone. Calmly, he said, I am a bit tired. I want to sit for a while. Once the agreement is reached, I will let him go. Within half a li, you cannot stop me. Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan nodded at the same time. Regardless of which side it was, their hearts were burning like wildfire. They were terrified that Fan Xian would do anything unfavorable to the Northern Qi Emperor. Fan Xian slowly let go of the Northern Qi Emperor's hand. The little emperor did not immediately retreat. Instead, he looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes as if he wanted to see some secret in them. The Northern Qi Emperor suddenly smiled helplessly and said, "You are very daring." Fan Xian also smiled helplessly. "I would never have thought that you would be able to guess everything I am thinking. I know you won't let me go." The Northern Qi Emperor looked at him coldly. "I am just curious. If this stalemate continues, you are already injured and your strength is gradually weakening. How will you be able to defend against a surprise attack from a few aces? Of course, I can't bear to let you go. Furthermore, I am indeed tired." There was no expression on Fan Xian's face. "I want to find a place to sit." The two of them did not speak loudly. The Northern Qi Emperor knew that even if he exposed Fan Xian's intentions in front of his officials, it would be difficult to change all of this unless he guessed what Fan Xian was preparing to do next. "Take a seat." In such a dangerous situation, where could Fan Xian go to sit and not worry about being hunted down by these aces? The Northern Qi Emperor's gaze suddenly landed on a New Year's painting hanging on the wall of the grass hut. His heart jumped. His eyes lit up. His thin lips opened slightly as he prepared to speak. However, Fan Xian did not give him another chance. Taking advantage of the moment the encirclement retreated, his expression darkened. His left hand stretched out like a snake. His fingertips pinched the Northern Qi Emperor's hand between his thumb and index finger. Twisting his thumb, he used a little trick to make a wave of pain in his right arm so that he could no longer summon it. In the instant that Fan Xian stretched out his hand like lightning, 13th Wang, who had been standing silently on the outskirts under a willow tree, slammed his palm into the willow tree. His face suddenly became deathly pale. His body began to tremble violently. The poison in 13th Wang's body had not been purged. His strength was not as good as usual, but the Jinqi in his body was still abundant. Particularly now that he had unleashed his full power, coupled with his usual indomitable aura, he immediately caused a ripple in the scene. His body trembled more and more violently. The willow tree under his palm also trembled more and more violently. After 3 breaths, with a crisp crack, the lower part of the willow tree snapped. 13th Wang let out an explosive cry. Holding the willow tree upside down with both hands, he used the tree as a sword. Gathering all of his cultivation into his hands, he demonstrated the most powerful attack of the Sigu sword. The tree trunk as a sword, the branches as a blade, and the leaves as the tip, sweeping away an army. Countless muffled groans rang out in the field, and smoke and dust rose. It was unknown how many experts reacted in the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint. They either dodged or slashed at the willow tree that seemed to have flown out of the sky, displaying their ultimate skills. They knew that when faced with such a willow tree that contained an aura and power, if they didn't use their full strength, they would probably end up with broken bones and shattered tendons if they took the slightest hit. The encirclement around the sword hut immediately fell into chaos. However, there were 2 people who did not panic. Lang Tiao and Yunjilan had not been confused by this willow tree that could sweep away an army. The 2 aces stared coldly at Fan Xian's every move. Suddenly, they turned into 2 black shadows and attacked Fan Xian from both sides. In the instant that 13th Wang broke through the willow tree and struck, Fan Xian had already finished adjusting his breathing and regained control of the Northern Qi Emperor. With a muffled grunt, he raised his body and leaped into the air. When Lang Tiao and Yunjilan came behind him, 13th Wang's willow tree also smashed toward Fan Xian's body. Fan Xian stood on his tiptoes in the air and beautifully raised his body by another half. The tip of his foot gently stepped on the top of the willow tree. With a puff, a leaf shattered into strands. A branch was soft and bouncy, but it seemed to have boundless rebounding power. It shook Fan Xian's body until it turned into a streak of light and headed toward the main door of the sword hut charged toward it. Lang Tiao's hands stretched out hurriedly. With a hiss, he tore off half of Fan Xian's clothes. The curved knives tied to his wrists flew through the air and slashed viciously, but they also missed. Yunjilan made a smooth turn in the air. The sword at his waist flowed out like water and slashed toward Fan Xian's completely exposed back. It only barely managed to cut open Fan Xian's right shoulder and draw out a trickle of blood. The willow tree 13th Wang held was too long and too big. The speed of the tree tip was too fast. It was so fast that it was as if it had sent Fan Xian flying. It was faster than the long-hidden attacks of Lang Tiao and Yunjilan. With a crisp crack, the grass door of the sword hut was smashed to pieces by Fan Xian. He grabbed the Northern Qi Emperor and charged forward like a gust of wind. Chapter 632. I had worked so hard to write 6,666 words in the last chapter, but it was 6,660. Speechless. P.S. I want a monthly vote. When 13th Wang's palm cut through the willow tree and Fan Xian turned into a butterfly, Lang Tiao and Yunjilan did not even look at each other. They could feel the regret and fear in each other's hearts. Only now did they understand why Fan Xian had not thought about retreating after being discovered in the mountain residence. Instead, he had fled toward the sword hut. That was why he had coincidentally subdued the Northern Qi Emperor. From the beginning, Fan Xian's goal had been the sword hut. He had come today to enter the sword hut and see Siga Jian. In midair, Lang Tiao let out a wild howl. The metal chains on his wrists clanked. The two curved knives sliced toward Fan Xian's back like two pieces of golden light. He knew that he could not allow Fan Xian to take the emperor hostage and enter the depths of the sword hut. Once he left his sight, no one knew what kind of terrifying conclusion Northern Qi would meet. Furthermore, he believed the emperor, who was subdued by Fan Xian. Although the emperor was young, his experiences these years had proven that he had insight and wisdom that far exceeded that of mortals. Since the emperor calculated that Fan Xian would not harm him, then Lang Tiao was going to bet on this. He was going to attack where Fan Xian had to save him and force him to withdraw his hand. The two pieces of golden light sliced toward Fan Xian's opening. The long sword in Yunjilan's hand was incomparably quiet. It calmly and evenly passed through the gap between the two pieces of golden light and pierced toward the back of Fan Xian's neck. The sword light spat out like a silver snake spitting out its tongue. The sword intent was swift and fierce. The sword intent of this strike was actually very similar to the sword intent 13th Wang had used earlier with the willow in his arms. They were both Siga Jian's most focused attacks that only cared about the front and not the back. Yunjilan's reason for taking the risk to attack was different from Lang Tiao's. He cared about the Northern Qi Emperor's life and death, but he didn't believe in the Northern Qi Emperor's judgment. However, he had a great reason not to let Fan Xian enter the sword hut because his teacher was inside. Due to different reasons, the two superior 9th-level aces made the same decision. At the same time, they used their trump cards. Regardless of the cost and even risking the risk of Fan Xian killing the Northern Qi Emperor, they sliced toward the large opening behind Fan Xian. At this time, the four people in the air were like birds flying above a stone plain in the front yard of the sword hut. Time seemed to have stopped at this moment. Fan Xian held the Northern Qi Emperor in his hand. Although his right hand held the black dagger, he was unable to stop the chill from behind him. Behind him, Lang Tiao and Yunjilan floated in midair. Their swords and sabers sliced through the air soundlessly, but their auras interfered with each other, giving off a chilling creaking sound. At this moment, if Fan Xian did not abandon her and turn back to save himself, only death awaited him. If he turned around to save himself, he would probably be heavily injured. Furthermore, the Northern Qi Emperor would certainly break free of his control. So, Fan Xian chose to do nothing. He continued to follow his fixed flight path and rushed toward the second door of the grass hut, completely ignoring the curved knife and straight sword behind him. He had left Jingdo, come to Dongyi, entered the mountain residence, and charged straight into the sword hut. It was all based on one judgment and one confidence. He did not believe that after the other party had shown so much sincerity, they would just watch as all this happened. This matter had nothing to do with luck. It was completely based on Fan Xian's judgment of the situation in the world, his insight into people's hearts, and his confidence in that strange old creature. Things happened as he wished. When the knives and swords were still half a foot from his back, the door 3 feet in front of him creaked open. The second door of the sword hut opened wide in front of the fleeing Fan Xian, welcoming his arrival. Fan Xian carried the Northern Qi Emperor and threw himself in. Then, the door closed with a bang, firmly shutting Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan outside, as well as the 2 curved knives and the long sword outside. The door of the grass hut was often only a symbolic separation. It was mostly made of hay and wood. Such a weak door had, in that instant, blocked between Fan Xian and the 2 aces behind him. How could such a door stop the red-eyed Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan? The scene outside the sword hut was in chaos. A dozen streaks of flowing light scattered, avoiding the willow tree. 13th Wang had abandoned the willow tree and stood alone. No one paid attention to him. They only turned their nervous gazes toward the door of the sword hut. They all clearly saw Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan, these 2 powerful warriors, chasing Fan Xian into the grass hut. However, after a moment, everyone was shocked speechless by the scene that followed. With 2 muffled grunts, 2 figures flew back wretchedly. It was Lang Tiao and Yun Jilan. When they had charged into the sword hut, they had been imposing. Now, they had retreated at an even faster speed. Their situation was wretched. Lang Tiao somersaulted a few times in the air. The power in his body rose to the limit. His 2 curved knives protected his body like rain. A golden light enveloped the area in front of him. No one knew what invisible power he was resisting. On the other hand, Yun Jilan lowered his head and restrained his breathing. One knee was raised slightly, and the other was extended horizontally behind him. His sword was held horizontally to his brow. He was very respectful and didn't dare to use his qi. He only used the pure Xinqi in his body to barely resist. He retreated quickly, not daring to stop at all. Lang Tiao spun faster and faster in the air. His 2 knives also sped faster and faster. In the end, they became 2 streaks of flowing light. With a loud cry, his 2 knives chopped down. After a muffled thud, his body stopped. A tree branch was cut in half by him and fell weakly to the ground. Lang Tiao pushed back with 1 foot and raised his brows. He forced himself not to retreat, but his chest felt heavy. In the end, the boundless killing intent contained in the tree branch had shattered his meridians. He spat out a mouthful of blood. Yun Jilan retreated even faster than Lang Tiao, more completely, and more respectfully. He had no intention of using the sword in his hand to resist anything. He was forced back 150 feet. He then knelt on 1 knee on the ground and raised his sword with trembling hands. A verdant leaf was attached to the blade of his sword. Everyone present was shocked. They watched as these 2 warriors were about to capture Fan Xian. Who would have thought that the person in the sword hut would only use a branch and a leaf to force these 2 warriors back? There were only a few people in this world who had such an unfathomable realm. The master of the sword hut was clearly one of them. It looked like the ruckus outside the sword hut had finally startled the ruthless sword saint. Sigajian had chopped off a branch and picked up a leaf to force back the 2 9th-level aces at the very top of the human world. The realm of a great grandmaster was indeed far beyond the mortal realm. However, in the end, this great grandmaster was still biased. So, he had thrown a leaf at his eldest disciple and a branch at Lang Tiao. When he saw the green leaf fly out of the second door, Yunjilan could only retreat in fear. Lang Tiao, on the other hand, was filled with an endless desire to fight. He forcefully took on the branch. That was why Lang Tiao was injured and vomited blood. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, this was what happened. Sigurd, who had been silent for almost 3 years and had hidden in the sword hut and not seen visitors for 3 years, finally made his move. It would have been fine if he hadn't made his move. Once he did, it was world-shaking and shocked the surroundings. Outside the grass door, all of the disciples of the sword hut knelt on the ground in unison and kowtowed in the direction of the sword hut. The disciples who had participated in the matter of controlling 13th Wang felt fear and a powerful sense of unease. Unconsciously, they began to search with their gazes for their eldest disciple brother's figure. Just like what was written in many novels, among the groups that were best at taking the blame, the eldest disciple brother would definitely take the most blame, such as the monkey. Yunjilan half knelt on the ground. His expression was calm, but the sleeve on his forearm trembled gently like it had been blown by the wind, revealing the true emotions in the depths of his heart. He didn't know when his teacher had come to the front of the sword hut. He also didn't know what his teacher thought of his actions. He only knew that he had to do this, even if his teacher did not allow it. Friar, he supported the injured Lang Tiao. The northern Chiases looked in shock at the tightly closed door of the sword hut. They didn't know what was happening inside or what was about to happen. Why would Sigurd help Fan Xian hold the emperor hostage? Was the emperor still safe? Their hearts were burning with anxiety. Under Sigurd's might, they did not dare charge in to save him. Even the most powerful of them, Sir Lang Tiao, could not defeat a branch casually thrown by Sigurd. This kind of difference in power could not be made up for with determination and courage. Lang Tiao slowly wiped away the blood at the corner of his lips and looked coldly into the depths of the sword hut. A complicated emotion flashed through his eyes. It was as if he felt that some things were beyond his expectations. Landing heavily on the hard stone ground, the tip of Fan Xian's foot pulled back in the moment of impact. Using the momentum, he bounced up. His palm had long let go of the little emperor's hand. Raising it, he held the black dagger upside down in his right hand. Half crouching on the ground, he stared at the wooden door behind him. In such a short amount of time, he had forcefully changed his position, prepared his killing move, and assumed the posture of a tiger fighting a rabbit. It had to be said that Fan Xian's present strength was indeed valiant. If Yunjilan and Lang Tiao had broken in at this moment, at least Fan Xian would not be as wretched as he was earlier. On the contrary, he would have been able to give them a lightning-fast attack. It was just that after a long time, that seemingly fragile grass door was still quietly closed. No one broke through the door, and even the sound outside the door gradually became weaker. This overly ordinary grass door seemed to be able to shut out all the wind, rain, and blood outside. It allowed the people inside to form their own unity and live peacefully in the sword hut, seeking their own happiness in seclusion. After a long time, Fan Xian slowly rose and looked at the door with narrowed eyes. He knew that since Yunjilan and Lang Tiao had not charged in earlier, they would not have the courage to make a second attempt, at least in a short period of time. Without even thinking, he knew why. Although the sword hut was a martial holy land, for Yunjilan, the only person who could drive him out was the master of the sword hut, that strange and ruthless great-grandmaster. Fan Xian was not surprised. The reason he had chosen to forcefully break into the sword hut earlier was because he had guessed that Sigurd would not just watch as he was taken advantage of. He was only curious as to what method Sigurd had used to express his attitude. It was completely silent inside the sword hut. Fan Xian turned around and found that the little northern Qi emperor was half sitting on the stone floor, holding his foot. It seemed that the collision earlier had injured him. Fan Xian was not in the mood to pay attention to him. He only calmly looked around. However, he did not see any trace of anyone. He did not see that branch or leaf. In the instant before he turned around, he faintly caught a familiar figure out of the corner of his eye. It was this figure that made him feel strange. Coming to the sword hut today, he did not bring the shadow. Who was that figure? If it was Sigurd, why did he feel it was familiar? On the stone floor, bits of grass slowly moved with the wind. The clamor outside the sword hut seemed to be a story from many years ago. Fan Xian walked to the northern Qi emperor's side and stretched out a hand to help him up. He then walked toward the third door in the sword hut. Just as the two of them were less than 3 steps away from the door, it was slowly pulled open from the inside. A child stuck out his head. His lively eyes moved endlessly, sweeping a few times between Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor. With a chuckle, he said, "Which of you is surnamed Fan? Which is surnamed Shan? I am the northern Qi emperor." The northern Qi emperor's face was deathly white. It looked like the injury to his ankle made him unable to endure the pain. Inside the sword hut, he still habitually opened his mouth to speak first. Fan Xian felt very strange. He didn't know what he would encounter in the sword hut. With a slightly mocking smile, he said, "Then, I can only be surnamed Fan." Hearing the two of them announce their surnames, the child smiled happily and pulled the grass door completely open. Bowing respectfully, he said, "Please follow me. The room is still inside." The child turned to lead the way. In Fan Xian's arms, the northern Qi emperor furrowed his brows. He had been in Dongyi for a number of days and had entered the sword hut many times. He was not unfamiliar with the roads, but he had never seen Sigurd in person. Fan Xian had broken through his and Yunjilan's obstruction and forcefully entered the sword hut. It looked like Sigurd was not angry. On the contrary, he had the intention of meeting the two of them. Thinking of this, the northern Qi emperor's state of mind became serious. He faintly sensed that something was wrong. Fan Xian's gaze was focused behind the child. The child carried a long sword on his back. It looked completely at odds with his thin figure. Before long, the child brought the two of them to a room deep in the sword hut. A servant woman brought in hot water and food before retreating, leaving the quiet room for Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor. The host had not said anything to meet them, so the two guests could only passively accept the arrangements. Deep in the sword hut, the room was unusually quiet. Fan Xian and the northern Qi emperor were alone in the quiet room. The atmosphere immediately became strange. Fan Xian walked to the window and pushed it open to look out. With a glance, he saw the large pit in the middle of the courtyard. His pupils constricted slightly. The northern Qi emperor sat on the side of the bed behind him and stared coldly at his back. "Fan Xian, right now, it's just you and me. If you have anything to say, you can say it." Fan Xian didn't turn his head. In a quiet voice, he replied, "I trust that Sigurd will be able to hear anything we say. However, I am indeed curious as to how you guessed I was hiding in Lily's room." The northern Qi emperor smiled strangely and didn't explain. On the contrary, he said, "I am also curious as to how you guessed I knew your whereabouts and arranged for someone to kill you." Fan Xian shrugged and pulled his gaze back from the various swords in the pit. Turning to look at the northern Qi emperor, he calmly said, "There is no need to explain this question. Actually, I am just a bit angry. Why have you become so stupid and childish?" He slowly lowered his eyelids and said, "Have you ever thought about what kind of price the world will pay after you kill me?" The little emperor furrowed his brows. He didn't know if it was because of the unbearable pain in his ankle or because Fan Xian had given him such a low evaluation. Fan Xian walked back from the window and sat on the stool in front of the bed. Calmly, he looked at the little emperor's face. Suddenly, he said, "You are no longer young, but I still habitually think of you as a little emperor." Facing the Northern Qi Emperor, he spoke as if he was talking to a commoner. The attitude and emotions Fan Xian displayed truly shook the Northern Qi Emperor's heart. This was not a matter of strength. It was a sense of equality rooted in the deepest parts of one's bones and blood. Even if it was Lang Tiao or Yun Jilan, when facing the Northern Qi Emperor, they would still be incomparably respectful. No one would be like Fan Xian, who saw the dignity of a ruler as nothing. Fan Xian calmly looked at the little emperor's delicate and ordinary face. His thoughts had drifted somewhere. He knew better than anyone else in the world how powerful this little emperor was. A few years ago, he, who was still rather immature, had already taken the lead in setting up the Jiangnan area of the Qin kingdom. Regardless of whether it was Fan Xian or the eldest princess who controlled the palace treasury in the future, he would receive some benefits from it. Another example was the death of Shinzhong, the commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guards. This little emperor had cleverly used Shang Shanhu and killed 3 birds with 1 stone. It had to be said that the emperor's heart was like a mirror. However, Fan Xian still could not understand why the emperor would want to kill him. During the Jingdo rebellion in the 7th year of the Qin calendar, the Northern Qi Emperor could have used the eldest princess's hand to kill him and then helped the great prince ascend to the throne, which would have been of great benefit to Northern Qi. Now, 3 years had passed. If he was killed in Dongyi, Northern Qi would not be able to stay out of it. Killing you in Dongyi can at least force Dongyi to be unable to surrender to the Qin kingdom. The little emperor looked at Fan Xian coldly. It was as if she was not afraid of explaining anything in front of him. As for whether or not your death will anger the Qin court, that is not within my consideration. Are you saying that if you don't die, your old emperor will not use military force against the Qi kingdom? The little emperor laughed coldly. Since regardless of whether you live or die, you will not be able to stop the war from erupting, your death can at least have Dongyi side with me. Why wouldn't I do such a good thing? Chapter 633. Of course, I didn't explode. I was just making up a chapter about getting drunk on National Day. I didn't think there would be a day when I would make up a chapter. I am becoming more and more diligent. After Fan Xian finished speaking, the Northern Qi Emperor did not think of the legendary blind great master. He did not, because of these words, begin to reflect on the mistakes he had made during these 2 years because of the Qin kingdom's powerful pressure. He only stared at Fan Xian in shock and unconsciously raised his hand to rub his forehead. The anger in his eyes gradually deepened. In the end, he could not suppress it. In a low voice, he roared, "You dare to hit me!" Fan Xian dared to hit him. Since he dared to kidnap an emperor, he dared to hit him a few times. The little emperor knew this. He just could not accept that Fan Xian would use a blow to hit him on the forehead. This kind of fighting was not a battle to the death. In his eyes, it carried a clear sense of humiliation. Fan Xian paid no attention to his anger. Furrowing his brows, he said, "During these years, you and I have worked well together. I think I have brought a great deal of benefit to Northern Qi. But, you constantly want me dead. Is that not too much?" The little emperor was still tormented by pain and humiliation. He stared at Fan Xian in disbelief. It was as if he didn't know where such a strange being had jumped out of this world to not have any respect for a worker like the emperor. Fan Xian saw him gritting his teeth like a little lion and was instead amused. Shrugging his shoulders, he said, "I am just pointing out the big mistake you have made." He suddenly closed his eyes and thought for a moment. In a quiet voice, he said, originally, the impression you left on me was that you were a shrewd ruler. However, your actions these past 2 years have been too eager for quick success. The world is so beautiful, yet you are so violent. This is not good, not good. The Northern Qi Emperor knew that the situation was not in his favor. He had fallen into Fan Xian's hands. Additionally, the great grandmaster in the sword hut who had never shown himself was leaning toward him. The officials outside the sword hut would probably not be able to enter the sword hut to save him. He could only forcefully suppress the anger in his heart and coldly say, "Why do I need to explain my actions to you? You don't need to explain to anyone, but you need to explain to me." Fan Xian's eyes narrowed, and a cold light flashed. "I've given you too many benefits. Even if it's an investment, you have to report it to me, the shareholder, instead of trying to kill me." The negotiation between the two men returned to the original place. The Northern Qi Emperor was silent for a long time. Slowly, she said, "I must admit that you have helped me a great deal in the past few years, but what? However, you are, after all, the Qing Emperor's illegitimate child." The little emperor smiled self-mockingly and stood up out of habit, placing her hands behind her back. If this was any other time, this movement would definitely be incomparably elegant and full of emperor's aura. However, today, he was dizzy from the shock and his ankle was sprained. How could he stand steadily? With a cry, he fell down. Fan Xian reached out and scooped him back onto the bed, looking at him calmly. The little emperor furrowed her brows and said, "You are a person of the Qing kingdom and the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. Regardless of whether or not I believe you have the sincerity to carry out the agreement, even mother and the officials in court cannot place this illusory hope on a powerful official of the Qing kingdom." He closed his eyes and slowly said, "You are not a person of Qi. You don't know how the ruler and people of Qi have lived these years after Imperial Advisor Kuhi's death. The Qing kingdom is ready for battle and could send out troops to invade at any moment. Although I have planned for a long time, in the end, the time is still short. It is difficult for the national strength to support a continuous war for many years. Under such circumstances, all past friendships and promises are empty. I must place my hope on my people, even Dongyi. I cannot place my hope on you." Fan Xian listened quietly. He knew this logic was actually very simple. Never mind the Northern Qi Emperor, even Haitang, Chen Pingping, and his father did not think he would actually help Northern Qi fight against the Qing kingdom. If he was going to be a traitor, there had to be some benefits. Presently, Fan Xian was a figure in the Qing kingdom who stood above tens of thousands of people. If he sold out the Qing kingdom's interests, did he want the Northern Qi Emperor to give him the throne? He smiled self-mockingly, thinking that no one in the world would believe this, much less the ruler and people of Northern Qi. However, he had never thought about selling out the Qing kingdom's interests to satisfy Northern Qi's request to establish a country. He only wanted to do his best to ease the possibility of a bloody battle to the end and rivers of blood. Just as Li Hongqing had criticized him in the Dingzhou general's manner, this was a childish and absurd idea. Furthermore, from a certain point of view, it was basically impossible. From this, it seemed that it was only natural that Northern Qi wanted to kill Fan Xian, a powerful Qing official, and tie Dongyi to their own chariot. As for the legendary blind great master, it was not that the Northern Qi Emperor did not know of this person. However, his whereabouts were too mysterious. Even if he was truly a great grandmaster standing behind Fan Xian, the threat he posed to Northern Qi was not as real as the powerful Qing Emperor and the powerful Qing army. Seeing that Fan Xian had sunk into thought, the Northern Qi Emperor did not disturb him. Instead, he also closed his eyes and began to think about his situation and what might happen next. One was the ruler of the north, and the other was an official of the south. Just like that, they faced each other in the quiet room, each with their own thoughts. They did not know that time flowed by like water. Without them realizing it, the sunset outside the hut was like blood. It shone on the sword pit, making the branches of the ancient broken swords seem to be dyed with the blood of thousands of years. No matter how long they were washed by the sea, wind and rain, they could not be washed clean. Fan Xian stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the large pit in silence. He knew what the countless swords in the pit represented. They represented Sigejian's world-dominating sword skills and power. They represented the position of the sword hut in the hearts of the people. They represented the deaths of countless swordsmen and the legends that made one's blood boil. For any kind of reputation or status to remain stable, it actually needed a baptism of swords and blood. In this world, Fan Xian did not have any ability to distinguish or judge how to give those who came after a better future. Did it also need a baptism of blood and fire from the south to the north? Even though he had once discussed it with Yan Bingyun and argued with Li Hongqing, he still did not have the ability to judge whether the separation of the world or the unification of it would be more beneficial. Prolonged pain. Short pain. Thank you. That was a question for historians. It was not a question that creatures born in the present needed to consider. Creatures only needed to consider the present. This was a selfish instinct of living things. Fan Xian was, without question, a selfish person. After he died, even if there was a flood, he only hoped that while he was alive, this world was like the one he liked. There were flowers, trees, grass, insects, birds, people, poems and paintings, wine and gold, no pain, no disaster, and no blood. Now, he deeply saw himself as a Qing person and not the internationalist warrior he had been in the beginning. Sadly, he had grown into a pacifist. He hoped that while he was alive and his children were alive, Spider-Man or Takashi Kato's famous hand gesture could always be raised. The Overwatch Council's nurturing from a young age and many years of jumping between life and death had allowed Fan Xian to grow into a pacifist. This appeared absurd and inconceivable, but it also proved from another angle that when a person was lying on a sick bed waiting for death, the obsession born could affect him for a lifetime or even 2 lifetimes. Only by knowing the terror of death did one know that one should treasure life. I know the reason for your mistake, Fan Xian slowly said without turning his head. The Qing kingdom has put too much pressure on you. Although the emperor has not sent out a large number of soldiers these years, each move he has made is all to prepare for the great battle in the future. The emperor walks an upright path. He has already eliminated the existence of great grandmasters, so he disdains using his great grandmaster's strength to disturb the world. He has enough confidence to conquer all of you in a fair and square manner. Fan Xian suddenly felt that the sunset outside was piercing to the eyes. He closed his eyes and said, "Actually, I understand the emperor very well." The failure of the northern expedition 20 years ago was a setback that was difficult for him to accept. For him, monsters like great grandmasters should not exist in this world, even if he himself later became a great grandmaster. He has his own mind and strategy. With these, he can conquer everything. He has a disdain for individual martial power from the depths of his heart. However, he had to first clean out the great grandmasters before he could release this disdain to the extreme. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. I think that before Ku he died, he saw clearly the obsession of my emperor. That is why he slowly placed chess pieces in Xiliang and my court. He wanted to play a final game of chess with the emperor. However, he forgot that, after all, he is already dead. It is impossible for him to know all the details of what happened after his death. Furthermore, Haitang and you, whom he placed his hopes on, have each made an unforgivable mistake. The little emperor had been silently listening to Fan Xian's analysis. Hearing this, she opened her mouth and asked, "What mistake?" You all underestimate my anger. Fan Xian turned around and looked at the little emperor. Enunciating each word, he said, I dare to guarantee you that the 2 moves he made before he died were both prepared to land on me. Yet, you tried to kill me twice. Regardless of whether you succeeded or not, if he knew of your actions, he would certainly die in his grave in anger. Land on you. The little emperor's pupils constricted slightly. She thought back to great uncle He's instructions before his death. Her expression gradually became serious. She still did not understand why she had placed the hope of Northern Qi's survival on Fan Xian. Was he not the Qing emperor's illegitimate child? Was Fan Xian really a great saint? No, the last saint in the world had died a long time ago in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. Fan Xian was only a common person. Fan Xian laughed coldly. Of course, He's calculations were very good. He had truly grasped my heart. Even in death, he could not guess whether or not I would continue down the path he imagined. The matter referred to in these words was too secretive. The Northern Qi Emperor could not hear it clearly. I will think of a way to control all of this. If I cannot control it, I can easily leave. Fan Xian walked out of the dusk outside the window. He grew closer and closer to the little emperor's body. In a slightly heavy voice, he said, It would be best if you could listen to me more. Why should I listen to you? For some reason, the little emperor suddenly felt a glimmer of coldness. Fan Xian looked at him and said, Because you have made too many mistakes. Although the Northern Qi court has been managed well by you these few years, and I had thought that another extraordinary Wu Zhou had appeared in history, in the end, I have found that women are still too easily angered and soft-hearted. They cannot hold up much. After these words were said, the little emperor's expression changed dramatically, but he immediately returned to his usual appearance. Narrowing his eyes, he said, Sir Fan Jr.'s words are becoming more and more mysterious. Earlier, you wanted to kill me. If you hadn't considered Sea Lily's life and had the eunuchs trick her out of the room, and had instead used Lang Tiao to directly attack, perhaps I would already be dead. Fan Xian stood in front of him and lifted his chin with a calm expression. The soft-heartedness of women was completely displayed at that moment. You have disappointed me so much. How could I continue to do business with you? The little emperor's eyes narrowed further and further until they became 2 crescent moons. It was as if he wanted to use the slits of his eyelids to look at Fan Xian even more. Only then could he calm the boundless fear and struggle in his heart. This was a secret he and the Northern Qi Empress Dowager had stubbornly kept for 20 years. For this secret, countless people had died in the Northern Qi court and paid a great price. Yet, at this moment, it had been lightly spoken of by a Qing person. My goal today is to enter the sword hut to see Sigurd, but I have another goal. I want to have a private conversation with you, Your Majesty. Fan Xian looked at him and said, I want to tell you that if you still want to be the Emperor of Northern Qi, from now on, don't try to secretly attack me. On the contrary, you have to cooperate with me. Do you understand? The little emperor pulled up the corners of his lips and laughed loudly. Fan Xian, you want to threaten me? You can kill me with one stroke of the knife and see if I, the descendant of the Zhan family, will frown. Your determination is truly admirable. Fan Xian looked at him with a smile in his eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, Naturally, I cannot kill her. I just want to know, if Shang Shanhu, Lang Tiao, and a group of important Northern Qi officials suddenly discovered that the emperor they are loyal to is actually a woman, what kind of reaction would they have? The Northern Qi Zhan family only has you, one woman. Is there still a need for it to exist? The little emperor stared fixedly at Fan Xian. At this moment, he finally understood why Sea Lily had said earlier that Fan Xian would not be afraid of him at all. Instead, it was he who should be afraid of him. It was because Fan Xian held his fate, the absolute fate. The little emperor's voice was raspy. He smiled coldly and said, "The immortal poet of a generation does indeed speak with an air of stupidity." His right hand seemed to not listen to his orders as it reached under the little emperor's chin and flicked. After removing the disguise on the little emperor's throat and removing the fake Adam's apple, even though her chest was still covered by the white cloth, the feeling of her entire person softened, gradually developing in the direction of a little girl. Fan Xian carefully studied her brows, her eyes, and gradually moved closer to her. It was as if he was admiring a unique treasure. He remained silent the entire time. He was indeed very surprised. How could a woman hide from the world for 20 years? She had been emperor in northern Qi for 20 years, but no one had been able to discover a single problem. His eyebrows had been trimmed since he was young, and they gradually grew thicker. There seemed to be some medicine at the corners of his eyes, which made the emotions in his eyes appear more stable. As for his gaze and manner, it was presumably the training the northern Qi Empress Dowager had given the little emperor since she was young. Fan Xian was only in the spirit of research. He was shocked by one of the greatest secrets in the world, which was why he moved closer and closer. He didn't notice that although the little emperor stood angrily and rigidly by the bed, the anger in her eyes grew fainter and fainter into hatred and coldness. The northern Qi emperor was a woman. Although this was something Fan Xian had guessed 3 years ago, if the two of them were not alone in the quiet room, he would never be able to confirm or use this in his entire life. Putting aside how he was going to use the northern Qi Empress Dowager and her son's greatest weakness in the future, just confirming this shocking secret was enough to make Fan Xian excited. Right at this moment, a fist that was definitely not as big as an earthenware bowl appeared in front of Fan Xian's eyes. The skin on the fist was smooth and tender. It was even possible to see a faint green vein. This also proved that the fist was very powerful, had accumulated power for a long time, and was very fast. With a muffled slap, 2 streams of fresh blood flowed out of Fan Xian's nostrils. He angrily covered his nose and glared viciously at the little emperor who still had her fist extended. He thought to himself that it wasn't because of this flat-chested woman that his nose was bleeding, so it wasn't too embarrassing. With his 9th level strength, he had actually been hit in the nose by a female emperor who had only learned a few tricks from Lang Tiao. This was actually embarrassing enough. If he had not been too engrossed, too shocked, and had too much desire to explore the little emperor's face, brows, eyes, and chest, he would not have been hit by this punch. The little emperor slowly pulled back her fist and smiled coldly. "In my life, I have never been so lightly humiliated by anyone. Anyone who looks down on me will pay the price." These words were said with an imposing aura. Paired with the little emperor's natural monarch face and the faint mockery at the corner of her lips, it was powerful without anger. It appeared to have some power. At this moment, the front of the little emperor's robe was completely torn. The strips of cloth hung weakly from the bright yellow sash. She was as wretched as one could imagine, yet she still made such an appearance. It was truly comical. Fan Xian did not laugh. After wiping away the blood from his nose, he calmly said, "I don't care about this punch, but I don't want it to happen again in the future. Don't forget, you are a woman. You are a woman." These words smashed viciously into the little emperor's heart, smashing her heart into chaos. Her liver and intestines were cut into pieces, and her heart trembled with fear. A wave of sadness, anger, and despair filled her heart. Even the messy black hair floating around her lips felt her emotions. It pressed into her lips and let her bite it viciously. Fan Xian was stunned by this hopeless expression. He was not a soft-hearted person. However, he had never thought that the little northern Qi emperor would one day reveal such a pitiful appearance. The Northern Qi court and various major events these years had already proven this female emperor's abilities. Under the powerful pressure of the Qin kingdom's ruler and officials, she was still able to maintain Northern Qi's stability. Just based on this, Fan Xian had to give her high marks for her ability to govern. 20 years of pretending and living as an emperor had, without question, twisted the little emperor's mentality somewhat. However, this kind of distortion was still within a controllable range. On the contrary, because she had to be on guard at all times against the leaking of secrets, she became even more cautious and prudent. She had a steadiness and maturity that others of her age could not have. Even when she was being restrained by Fan Xian, she still did not panic. When Fan Xian mercilessly reminded her that her secret could become known to the world tomorrow, she finally could not bear it anymore. Her hard outer shell shattered into countless pieces like a sea snail after being crushed by a large rock. The little emperor's gaze was very hateful and angry, but there was a strange calm inside. It was a calm like a deathly stillness. After the calmness, a crazed expression gradually appeared. Fan Xian had seen this kind of expression before. In the instant before the eldest princess Li Yunrui died, his heart grew nervous. He slowly lowered his hands, ready to act at any moment. The little emperor's expression was slightly wooden. She opened her lips and allowed her black hair to slide down. In an icy voice, she said, "I am not a person who will be threatened." She thought she could guess what Fan Xian would do after knowing her secret. With such a large secret in his hands, given the Overwatch Council's power, he could easily shake the foundations of the Northern Qi royal family's rule. The entire North would sink into chaos because of this news. "You cannot use me. If you expose this matter, I will have no value to you. If you hide this matter, how could I allow you to use me?" The little emperor looked at Fan Xian hatefully. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then slowly lowered his head and said, "I don't ask for much. I just want you to be more obedient." The corners of his lips twitched up in self-mockery. "After all, you are a woman. No matter how powerful you are, at certain critical junctures, you will never be able to stand up to us stinky men. It is impossible to rely on you to accomplish great things." The little emperor's eyes narrowed. "It looks like you have long thought about what will happen next, but why would I listen to you?" After these words were said, determination flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Viciousness surged. She took out a small dagger from somewhere in her sleeve and viciously stabbed it toward her chest. After entering the sword hut, Fan Xian felt safe. He did not take the little emperor seriously, so he did not search the little emperor's body. After all, he knew she was a woman and didn't want to offend her too much. He had no idea that the little emperor still had the last dagger she could use to kill herself. Had this dagger been given to her by the Northern Qi Empress Dowager when she was very young? For some reason, a faint glimmer of sympathy suddenly surged in Fan Xian's heart. He sympathized with the female emperor in front of him. She lived in constant fear that her gender would be discovered and that she could not live like other girls. How could there be any joy in such a life? He swept closer and flicked the tip of his finger, flicking the little emperor's pulse. With a clang, the little dagger fell to the bottom of the bed. A viciousness flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Her left hand silently moved the crossbow in her sleeve. Fan Xian's strange cry rang out in the room. He forcefully twisted his body beside the bed. His body rolled like a gray dragon. In an extremely dangerous situation, he avoided the 3 crossbow bolts. His clothes had already been slightly torn by the 3 poison bolts. Fortunately, he was still wearing the Overwatch Council's uniform underneath. Otherwise, this attack alone would have injured him. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and threw the little emperor onto the bed. Pressing down on her shoulders with both hands, he angrily threw a punch, landing squarely on the little emperor's cheek. His anger was because he had just felt some sympathy for this female emperor and had almost been secretly injured by her. Only now did he understand that she was, after all, an emperor, a third kind of creature outside of men and women. When faced with the greatest predicament of her life, she would not hesitate to pay any price, even her own life, to kill him. Blood flowed from the corners of the little emperor's lips, but she did not faint. She lay proudly and resentfully on the bed. Looking at Fan Xian straddling her, she said, "If you have the guts, kill me." Of course, Fan Xian would not kill her. After grasping her secret, as long as he could truly subdue her heart, this ruler of a country would become, after Uncle Wu Zhu, his third magical treasure in this world. How could he subdue a stubborn, intelligent emperor who had been a man for 20 years and acted with a masculine decisiveness? The shortest path through a woman's heart was her body. Fan Xian understood this principle. He rode on the little emperor's body and felt the elasticity unique to a woman under him that could not be faked. He knew how ambiguous this position was and how full of spring. After all, he was not a rapist. Furthermore, he did not think that he would be able to achieve his goal after raping the Northern Qi Emperor. Given his judgment of the little emperor, if he let the little emperor go after this, perhaps she would only take hot water to wash her lower body and treat it as if she had been bitten by a dog. She would never see his face again and cut off all of his follow-up methods. The little emperor struggled under Fan Xian's body. Having been raised as a boy, her strength was far more powerful than her martial cultivation. Fan Xian was momentarily distracted and almost flipped over by her. Fan Xian looked at the blood at the corners of her lips and her resentful gaze. A wave of annoyance and anger welled up in his heart. Lowering his voice, he roared angrily, "You are such a troublemaker. You want to kill me, that's why I'm dealing with you." Dealing with me? The little emperor suddenly stopped struggling. A fist smashed toward Fan Xian's beautiful and loathsome face. She said angrily, "Do you still dare to rape me?" Fan Xian dodged this sinister punch and finally found it difficult to suppress his anger. Feeling wronged, he said angrily, "It was you who raped me back then. How dare you say I was going to rape you?" The little emperor's expression changed. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene that happened in the rundown temple outside Shangjing that summer. Her entire strength weakened. What kind of person was she to treat the emperor as a skilled worker? She knew that she could not lower her head to Fan Xian at this moment. Otherwise, she would be oppressed by him for the rest of her life. Thus, she angrily lowered her head and slammed it toward Fan Xian's chin, intending to turn over and become the master. After the little emperor heard the words, "that summer," it was as if she had gone crazy. She attacked Fan Xian in a frenzy. Biting, twisting, and hammering. No one knew where such a crazy aura and boundless power came from in this little body. Fan Xian did not want to kill her. For a moment, he was beaten into a wretched state. A few red marks appeared on his arm from her bite through his clothes. He was also bitten into a rage. He slapped toward her body with one palm as if he was hitting Fan Xian's butt. Perhaps the spectators watching the farce in the sword hut would ask, why didn't Sir Fan Jr. knock the little emperor unconscious? The reason was simple. Unconscious people always wanted to wake up. If he didn't make the little emperor yield, Fan Xian would have taken all these risks for nothing. There was another reason he could not say it aloud. In reality, fighting with a female emperor was like fighting with children. Their ears rubbed against each other, their clothes tangled, and their limbs intertwined. It felt like the water in West Lake rippling and gradually flowing into the boat, the bed, and the hearts of the people on it. The two of them carried out a close contest on the bed. It was what was known as judo. Those who had seen judo knew that one of the necessary moves was to pull at clothes. However, even the sturdiest clothes would one day be pulled apart. In the end, the little emperor's white cloth made of an unknown material finally broke. It made the second tearing sound in the dark room. Fan Xian was sitting on her body. His eyes were filled with a boundless expanse of snow. His gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself that she was not only a woman but also a great woman. There were red plum blossoms on the snow. The man and woman playing in the snow were both tired. The little emperor sat on Fan Xian's body with disheveled clothing and pressed down on his hands. She completely did not notice that half of her chest was exposed. It was all in Fan Xian's eyes. The current situation was more like the little emperor raping Fan Xian. The long black hair at the corner of the little emperor's forehead was wet with sweat and stuck together. Paired with her straight brows, it gave her a particularly elegant feeling. Everyone in the world respected her as an emperor and never dared to look directly at her. Even if they did, it was impossible to see any other feeling. However, in Fan Xian's heart, she was a proper woman. Looking at this scene, he felt a sense of excitement he had never felt before. A woman with weakness in her strength, a woman with the identity of an emperor, a woman who would never be satisfied with being ridden on by someone else, clung tightly to him and carried out the most intimate contact. The little emperor rode on Fan Xian's body and didn't feel that Fan Xian had suddenly sunk into silence. She was almost out of strength. She didn't know what her future or Northern Qi's future was. Hopelessness filled her heart. The events of 20 years had made her incomparably tired. She wanted to lie down, but her identity as the Northern Qi Emperor made it impossible for her to lie down and rest. She suddenly felt that she was very pitiful and blinked her eyes helplessly. Following this blink, a few drops of sweat slid down her long black hair and landed on Fan Xian's chin. Like a drop of oil entering a fire, it lit the fire in Fan Xian's heart. "Is this the position in the temple?" Fan Xian's voice was raspy as he looked at the face and the slightly moving snowy mound close to him. The little emperor held his hands and lowered her head weakly. Boundless sorrow, dissatisfaction, and anger rose in her heart. She suddenly raised her head and stared fiercely into Fan Xian's eyes. Perhaps she was thinking of the scene in the temple or had made up her mind to decide something in the middle of her life as an emperor, even if it was a crazy and absurd thing. Chapter 635. Good, I finally wrote 6,666 words yesterday. What's funny is that I couldn't do it the day before yesterday when I tried to do it. Yesterday, I wrote carelessly and wrote this many words. The title of today's chapter is Every Emperor, Every Minister. Of course, it's the Chao of day and night, not the Chao of dynasty. I said yesterday that today's chapter was difficult to write. After I finished it and looked back, I found that it was indeed difficult to write. A paragraph of 4,000 words took up 40,000 words of my energy. In this life, I have never written such words. To be able to write at this level, I admire myself very much. It is not only related to eroticism, but also the revealing of my hidden personality. I didn't change Lu Lang to Fan Lang because it was a homophonic sound and it was fun to play around with it. As soon as their lips touched, the heavenly thunder and earthly fire moved, and the wind and rain raged. The two of them were like young beasts on the grassland as they bit each other. There was not much gentleness and charm, only a hint of excitement mixed with hatred. The blood between their lips rippled on the tips of their tongues. It was salty, wet, and salty. This was not intimacy or seduction. It was purely a battle between a man and a woman. The use of lips and tongues in battle often walked the path of Su Qin or Zhang Yi. No one had thought that even a kiss could be kissed to the point of blood. A tongue that was like an orchid could also be so stubborn, bouncing, struggling, and forcefully suppressed. In a small space, it transformed into endless symbolic meaning. Either the east wind overpowered the west wind or the west wind overpowered the east wind. The soft fragrance between the lips and teeth viciously and erotically displayed the process of battle. It made one's tongue ache and salivate, giving birth to the gradually accumulating desire of spring. Liao had said that when a man saw a woman other than one place that was hard, the rest of the place would go soft. Although Fan Xian was a person with a firm will, under such erotic attacks, he was naturally ridden by the little emperor. He was unwilling and tried to resist. Both of his hands hit the other's buttocks forcefully. The tender place that was usually hidden under the dragon robe made people want to ask him, was he hitting someone or was he flirting with them? The twilight outside the quiet room was getting darker and darker, but the temperature inside was getting higher and higher. The air seemed to be filled with the dual aura of battle and intimacy. The aura was mixed together with the faint smell of sweat. From time to time, muffled groans could be heard, making one's heart sway. Someone bit someone's tongue, causing a cry of pain. Someone crushed someone's moon, causing a soft hum. Someone scattered someone's long hair, causing it to scatter on their snow-white skin. Someone hugged someone's waist, causing angry curses and even more intense rubbing to occur. A cut appeared at the corner of Fan Xian's lips. He gazed at the little emperor on top of him, at her fragrant shoulders and jade chest, as well as the stubborn and unyielding gaze in her eyes. With a muffled grunt, he flipped over and pushed her down onto the bed. Pressing down on top of her, he stared fiercely at her. The little emperor did not show any weakness. She stared back viciously and bit down on Fan Xian's shoulder again. She threw out a punch. Her waist exerted strength, wanting to spring up and take back control of the initiative. Fan Xian's expression finally changed. The large wooden bed in the sword hut creaked. He pressed down heavily on the little emperor's shoulders and gazed at her, panting endlessly. He didn't say anything. He only looked into her eyes, wanting to see something more real in them and not something as inexplicable as it was now. Unfortunately, he saw many things in the little emperor's eyes, such as hatred, hidden bitterness, hopelessness, relief, strong desire, and a faint sense of confusion. However, he did not see a glimmer of calculation or anything else. The battle between men and women was often like this. When one discovered that the other had already sunk in first, they would often follow and jump in. Feeling the endlessly struggling and tender body beneath him, the rising and falling curves, the two lumps of softness against his chest, the slightly cool skin covered in beads of sweat, and particularly the shape and bounciness he could feel with his body pressed tightly against each other, the calmness in Fan Xian's eyes turned into a wisp of smoke after a moment. Following the little emperor's laborious and quiet hum by his ear, he flew up into the sky and could no longer control anything. His hand slid down from her shoulder and gently held it. Her upper body rose. Her lips slid down from his ear to his shoulder and bit down viciously. He was in pain, so he used more force, causing the thing in his hand to change shape. She was in pain, uncomfortable, and strange, so she trembled. Unconsciously, she hugged his body and straightened her upper body with difficulty. Pressing against him, she felt his heartbeat and her own disappointing heartbeat, as well as that strange and complicated feeling of stimulation. In the quiet room, there were no other sounds. There were only heartbeats, panting, clothes rubbing against each other, and the occasional gust of wind from a fist and two cries of pain. The movements grew louder and louder. The wooden bed was almost unable to endure such torture. The creaking grew clearer as if it was going to fall apart at any moment. It was confused as to what the man and woman above were doing. If they wanted to do it, then do it well. Life was only a short 70 years. Why fight for this moment? However, what the man and woman were fighting for was this moment. They heard each other, loved each other, and played with each other. They distanced themselves and then pulled closer. Feeling the other's burning body temperature, they suddenly left with palpitations, but they were also reluctant. Sweat dripped onto the thin blanket and floated faintly on the two of them. It seemed to have been evaporated by the extremely hot atmosphere in the room and turned into a thin mist, concealing the man and woman who were entangled together inside. The silent battle had reached its most critical moment. The clothes were like snow and had long melted in this scene of three springs. The two people who had returned to the primitive era panted and looked at each other in a daze. They stuck together. In the end, the little emperor still flipped over and became the master. She sat on Fan Xian's abdomen. Her hands pressed against Fan Xian's well-proportioned and hard chest. Her black hair fell down and half covered the snowy mound in front of her chest. Her breathing was uneven. "I want to be on top." There was a patch of mud between the two of them. Sweat followed the black hair and dripped onto Fan Xian's chest and the little emperor's hands. Fan Xian looked at the woman on top of him and felt the strange movement below. His heart beat violently, but he forcefully maintained his state of mind. In a raspy voice, he asked, "I want to know your name." The little emperor was not a normal woman. She was used to being a man and not a delicate woman. Even at such a time full of spring, she still wanted to be on top. As an emperor, she could only ever ride others and not be ridden. She had to be on top. Fan Xian did not care about this. He was a modern person. He knew action and reaction. He knew what the theory of relativity was. Being ridden and riding were all the same. He only had to know the other person's name before that moment happened. In order to become one with him, it had to be a woman with a name, his woman, and not just a female emperor. Emperor was just a title, but a name represented much more. The Northern Qi Emperor's upper body was naked. The clothes on her lower body were piled up. They barely covered her waist and buttocks, but they could not hide the heat and mud inside. There was no longer the despair and resentment from before in her eyes. There was only competitiveness and a powerful curiosity toward unfamiliar things, as well as the habitual order of an emperor. The secret room was silent. No one knew how long the two of them had tormented each other, hurt each other, or been intimate. This was the first time they had spoken. After these two sentences, the atmosphere in the room seemed to have changed subtly, particularly after hearing Fan Xian ask for her name. The little emperor allowed her black waterfall-like hair to sweep across his handsome face. Stretching out her fingertips, she slid them confusedly across his picturesque brows and eyes. In a raspy voice, she said, "You can call me Daodu right now." Jean Daodu. Fan Xian only had time to ask in his heart before he sucked in a cold breath. She gently swayed her waist and buttocks and slowly sat down on his abdomen. As she sat down, the tips of her brows furrowed together as if she was in great pain. The mountain path was narrow. Although it was covered in mud, it made the journey even more difficult. If one wanted to cross the Yellow River, one had to climb the snow-covered mountains of Taihang. Fan Xian's chest rose and fell. His hands unconsciously slid down her alluring waist and gently placed them on the two lumps of softness in the depths of her clothes. He gently pinched them. Idle, fishing in the green stream, suddenly riding a boat to dream of the sun. The path is difficult, and the paths are many. Where is peace now? She gently bit her lower lip, feeling a slight pain. However, she refused to let go for a moment of the hands pressing down on Fan Xian's shoulders. She moved her body slowly, forcefully, and even somewhat domineeringly. The burning pain made her expression appear particularly serious. She was like a ruler conquering all the difficulties and obstacles in the world. Seeing this scene, Fan Xian's expression changed. He was even slightly confused. His hands unconsciously began to move. After an indeterminable amount of time, the ice and snow gradually melted. The wind broke through the waves and gradually reached the vast ocean. The two of them slowly came together and held each other tightly. They trembled because of the pain, trembled because of intoxication, and trembled because of the shyness that had finally floated to the top of the woman's heart. Time gradually passed, and dusk gradually disappeared. The man and woman on the bed were either on top or below. Although they were silent and stubborn, alluring and twisted, no one was willing to admit defeat. No one was willing to lower their heads. A new emperor brought a new group of officials. On the large bed, the relationship between the ruler and his officials had long fallen into chaos. The fragrant path was once swept by a drunken guest. The door was opened for you for the second time. The peach blossoms were all gone, and where did they go? When this battle finally ended, it was Fan Xian who successfully returned to the top. He didn't know how many times he had fought with this stubborn woman. Finally, he successfully took advantage of the moment when her entire body was limp to take back control. This battle was crazy and rough. Fan Xian lay on top of her, panting. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the wound on his shoulder. He found that the woman beneath him had bitten him until his flesh was a bloody mess. He couldn't help a wave of fear. Lowering his head to look, he saw that the beautiful person in his arms no longer had the usual lofty appearance of an emperor. Her cheeks were rosy, and her gaze was blurry. Her thin lips were slightly open, and her breath smelled like orchids. She was very tired. How was she different from a normal woman? The only thing that was a bit blinding was the green mark on her snow-white chest. Fan Xian's heart thumped. He wondered how he could have been so rough earlier. After a man had his desires fulfilled and exploded, he would change from an animal to a hypocritical saint. He would be willing to light a cigarette and read a newspaper, but he would certainly immediately break away from the woman in his arms. Fan Xian was no exception. He gently held the little emperor's naked body and did not leave. Instead, he watched her quietly, thinking about something. This scene had actually happened 4 years ago. However, at that time, Fan Xian was completely unconscious and didn't know what had happened. What he felt now was very real. It involuntarily gave rise to an absurd feeling in his heart. This long-haired woman was the emperor of Northern Qi, the ruler of a country. Yet, at this moment, she was curled up in his arms like a little rabbit. The little emperor was tired. Her eyes were closed. Her not long eyelashes blinked slightly. She probably hadn't fallen asleep, but she held Fan Xian's waist and refused to let go. The corners of her lips twitched slightly as she sighed in satisfaction. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian should be proud. For some reason, he suddenly felt a chill. He remembered a movie he had seen in his last life. It was the movie that everyone loved, When Sally Met Harry. In the end, Megan cried and had a runny nose as she slept with Billy Crystal, her best friend of more than 10 years. In the end, she pouted her lips and sighed in satisfaction. She was like a pregnant female praying mantis, preparing to enjoy the feast of the male praying mantis later. The story of Fan Xian and the little emperor going to bed today was actually just as strange and expected. She had also cried, in a moment earlier. Thus, Fan Xian felt afraid. He was afraid that he would become a male praying mantis. It was at this moment that the little emperor opened her eyes and woke up. She did not pick up the thin blanket to cover her naked body. She brazenly exposed herself in front of Fan Xian. It was as if this was still her country and Fan Xian was her official. She was silent for a moment. Suddenly, she glanced at Fan Xian with complicated emotions. Smiling slightly, she said, "I am your woman." Fan Xian didn't know what he should say right now. Hearing these words, he still felt incomparably awkward. "I want to be on top. I am your woman. I. It was truly a headache-inducing word. The little emperor sat up and very naturally combed her hair in front of Fan Xian. Her eyes looked at the night outside the window. Enunciating each word, she said, "I can promise you that in this life, there will not be another man. Of course, I will not ask you not to find other women. However, you should understand that since I have become your woman, my country is also your country. You have to be careful." Chapter 636. I won't ever write such words again. It's too tiring. Of course, if I only wanted it to be romantic and smooth, I should be able to write it better. The problem is that I can't write it like that. I mainly want to control the whole process and not say a word that shouldn't be said. It's too difficult, but I tried my best. I think everyone can see that. As for those who really had the same interest in details, you can just look at Zhang Shan and The Secret. Those are the true experts, not too much, not too little. It was just a drop of tear. Fan Xian looked at this scene and couldn't help but shake his head, but he couldn't say anything. He felt around for a moment and found a silk handkerchief from his clothes. He put it next to the little emperor's face. He gently dipped it in the water. The little emperor was startled and immediately recovered her calm with a shocking speed. Her bare arms easily slid into her plain white clothing. Her black hair fell to her shoulders, and her expression was calm. There was no longer any charm. Paired with her indifferent eyes, she gave off a sense of antiquity that was unique to Shangjing. She gazed at Fan Xian calmly until his hair stood on end. Only then did she slowly say, "Help me comb my hair." After saying this, she turned her body. Her smooth neck, thin back, and jet black hair faced Fan Xian's eyes. She took out a Zhang Shan wood comb from somewhere and placed it in Fan Xian's hands. In this world, as long as a woman was married, there would always be a very complicated hair combing ceremony on the morning of the second day. Wealthy families would naturally have a nanny or a high-status servant to take care of it. If it was a poor family, then the mother-in-law would personally comb the daughter-in-law's hair. The Northern Qi Emperor probably had no chance of marrying. As a woman, it had to be said to be a kind of tragedy. In such a deep night, she wanted Fan Xian to comb her hair for her. Fan Xian accepted the comb and slowly began to move his arm, allowing the well-spaced wooden teeth to slide through the jet black hair. The little emperor's black hair gradually smoothed out. Fan Xian's heart and hers also gradually became clear. Fan Xian knew how to embroider and comb hair. He was a good man in the boudoir. In a moment, he had combed the little emperor's hair into a style that was clearly different from that of a virgin. It was also not the style of a mature woman. Borrowing the faint moonlight shining through the window, the little emperor looked at herself in the mirror for a while. She seemed to be very satisfied with Fan Xian's handiwork. During the process of combing their hair, the two of them did not say a word, each deep in thought. It seemed that for a time, neither of them knew how to deal with the situation between them. A moment later, Fan Xian broke the silence and asked, "Why me?" This question was not about today, not about state affairs, not about the last sentence the little emperor said in a drunken manner. It was only pointing to that summer several years ago, to that small temple in that summer. In this generation of the Northern Qi royal Zhan family, other than a few princesses, there was only this cross-dressing little emperor. If they wanted to continue the bloodline of the Northern Qi royal family for a long time, the little emperor needed a child of her own. Even if she had to take a great risk, she still wanted to give birth to a child of her own. That was why, on that summer night a few years ago, Haitang Duo had stopped at nothing to enchant Fan Xian in that temple. Fan Xian only wanted to confirm one thing. Why did Zhan Daodu, the little emperor, choose him to become the target of the seed? Perhaps in some people's eyes, becoming a stud horse was humiliating, but Fan Xian did not feel this way. His mother in this life seemed to have done something similar many years ago. Furthermore, to become a stud horse, it meant that the horse's bloodline was excellent and powerful. Was this another form of recognition? The little emperor sat silently in front of him and didn't reply for a long time. Suddenly, she said, "Your hair is a mess. I'll comb it for you." Fan Xian did not refuse. He handed over the comb and sat quietly by the bed. The little emperor half knelt on the bed and used her knees to crawl behind Fan Xian with great difficulty. She began to comb his hair. The little emperor's posture was very obedient. Kneeling behind Fan Xian and leaning slightly against him, she truly looked like a little wife. However, her hands were not very nimble. As someone who had been an emperor from birth, she was indeed worthy of the evaluation of not working in all four limbs. She had never done anything, much less something as technical as combing hair. The wooden comb slid through Fan Xian's long black hair with great difficulty. Occasionally, it tangled together, making Fan Xian furrow his brows slightly. He didn't make a sound to remind her. He only remained silent. He combed the little emperor's hair to sort out her slightly chaotic heart after their first love and to comfort her extravagant hopes of marrying someone. The little emperor combed his hair because she wanted to appear more like a normal wife. The little emperor knelt behind him and combed her hair earnestly and incompetently. Her gaze lowered slightly and landed on the edge of the bed beside Fan Xian's hand. There were a few thin needles arranged closely there. They glowed with a different light. Some were poisonous, some were not. When they had been intimate earlier, she had already noticed that Fan Xian had carefully removed these items from his hair. She couldn't see Fan Xian's face and could only look at his back. The little emperor's expression relaxed greatly. It made her feel at ease to be able to not let Fan Xian see her expression. In that instant, a faint affection and infatuation surged into the little emperor's eyes. Although it immediately became calm, it still revealed the true affection she had for this young man in the depths of her heart. This was also what Fan Xian didn't understand. Why had he been chosen? Did the little emperor really like him? "Your bloodline is very good." The little emperor lowered her head slightly. Her bangs gently swayed in front of her forehead. "Since I am going to have a child, of course, I hope to find a good father for the child. What is so good about my bloodline?" Fan Xian felt the comb stop on his head. Slowly, he said, "The blood of the Qing royal family flows in my body. Are you willing to let such a child become the future ruler of Northern Qi?" The little emperor started slightly and began to move the comb again with some difficulty. In a quiet voice, she said, "At that time, Duo, Lily, and I did not know you were the Qing emperor's illegitimate child. Then, what exactly do you see in me?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly and slowly lowered his head. Using the bright and cunning moonlight, he looked at the little emperor's smooth leg beside his waist stretching out from under the white clothing. His back was very warm and soft. It felt good. The little emperor sighed. As she combed her hair, she said, "This matter can't be hidden from you. If I said I saw the tea on my bloodline, it wouldn't make sense." "Of course, it wouldn't make sense," Fan Xian replied calmly. "At that time, no one knew my mother's surname was Yi." The little emperor was silent for a long time. Suddenly, she said, "You haven't written story of the stone in many years." "Yes." Fan Xian was absent-minded. He seemed to think of the 2 years when their relationship was very harmonious. Every time he wrote a chapter in Jingdo, he would use the Overwatch Council's fast horses to send it to Northern Qi's Shangjing and into the little emperor's hands. The first people in this world to recognize that he had written the story of the stone was Haitang Duo and this little emperor. The call of Grand Master Chao in the palace at night had given Fan Xian a great fright. At that time, he had always thought that this little emperor was just a bit frightening. He had not imagined that the body under the dragon robe was an enchanting woman. "I once told you that I liked Banksian's high poetry," the little emperor said calmly with a slight twitch of her lips. Fan Xian made another sound of acknowledgement. "Also, you don't look bad. Your personality can be considered straightforward. You don't look like a typical corrupt scholar." The little emperor lightly said a few words that made Fan Xian sink into silence. He knew that she was using these 3 sentences to express a certain meaning. After a long time, he said, "You like me." The little emperor thought for a long time and then nodded her head. She didn't care if the back of Fan Xian's head could see this action. Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and gently played with the bangs on her forehead. Gently, he said, "However, my woman must listen to me." Earlier, when the little emperor had woken up from her drunken stupor, her first words had pierced straight into Fan Xian's heart. "My country is your country." If it was a normal person in Fan Xian's position, they would probably have a terrible headache. However, he was not the same. From a long time ago, he knew that his actions were far from the ideals of the people in this world. He was mentally prepared for this. Since it was his country, it had to be controlled by him. Even the Northern Qi Emperor had to submit to his will. Conquering the ruler of a country seemed to be something that could never be done. However, conquering a woman, and a woman who liked him at that, no matter how determined her will was or how powerful she was, he could still find a sliver of a chance. A new ruler brought a new court of officials. This was a process of conquering and being conquered. Fan Xian only hoped that since they had this brief relationship, she could become more feminine. However, the development of the situation seemed to have broken away from Fan Xian's control. The little emperor looked at him calmly. There was not a trace of tiredness or dependence after venting. There was only eagerness and dissatisfaction. Fan Xian looked at her eyes nervously. He didn't know what she would do next. "You are my man. Why can't you listen to me?" The little emperor looked at Fan Xian calmly with a slight smile in her eyes. Without waiting for Fan Xian to speak, she gently bit her lower lip and moved closer to his ear. "How about we fight again and listen to whoever wins?" The two of them were hugging each other without a gap between them. Suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's heart jumped. He thought to himself, who's afraid of a fight between witches? This was the little emperor's first taste of a man and a woman. Additionally, she had a strong personality and was not afraid of pain. She was only curious and happy. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was attracted by her identity, as well as the stubbornness hidden in her bones. They both felt this kind of challenge was very exciting. It was like the meeting of dry wood and raging fire. They both thirsted for each other's bodies. It was truly shameless to use a matter of national importance as an excuse to mess around. A rare charm flashed through the little emperor's eyes. Fan Xian's hand tightened and they fought again. In the sword hut near the seaside, the sky brightened very early. It was still early in the night, but faint morning lights spilled into the grass hut. Under the large bed, the two people slowly woke up. They were so tired that they could barely open their eyes. The little emperor was exhausted but happy. She curled up in Fan Xian's arms to catch up on sleep. Last night's madness had perfectly made up for Jean Daudou's many years of spiritual regret. It made her finally realize that being a woman seemed to be a happy thing. However, it had also drained all of the energy in her body. It was clear that Fan Xian, who had obtained the final victory, was even more tired. He opened his eyes and looked at the eaves above his head. An absurd feeling suddenly rose in his heart. Such a thing as conquering had, in the end, fallen to the matter of a brother in bed. Yan Bingyan's mocking words that year had now become reality. If Sir Yen Jr. saw this scene and knew the details, he would probably jump down from the Overwatch Council in shock. Was this the legendary, swinging a stick around the world? Fan Xian thought self-mockingly. He lowered his head to look at the woman in his arms with slightly red cheeks. Last night had been crazy. In the end, this female emperor's outer shell of concealment had been shattered by him and she had become a true woman. As for Fan Xian's hard work, it was not worth talking about to others. A strange light suddenly flashed through his eyes. Lifting the covers, he randomly threw on a robe and walked to the door. The little emperor woke up. She was confused and shocked. She didn't know what had happened. The sound of footsteps came to the door. The sword boy's respectful voice rang out. After he left, he carefully opened the door and brought back a large basin of hot water and all kinds of snacks, as well as some tools for washing up. Looking at this scene, the little emperor half sat on the bed. Her expression became serious. After the madness came clarity. She finally understood what she had done last night and what it represented. Most importantly, this place was not the Northern Qi royal palace. It was also not the legendary Taiping courtyard that Fan Xian had heavily guarded. Rather, it was a relatively unfamiliar place. The Sword Hut. Given Fan Xian's realm, he did not have to worry about someone eavesdropping. Last night, when the little emperor had indulged herself, she had not considered this problem. However, the arrival of the sword boy and the large basin of hot water made the little emperor remember clearly that the person living in the sword hut was no one else but a great grandmaster. Although the sword hut was large and the courtyard was deep, there were still sounds during the madness last night. Although Sigurd was heavily injured and on the verge of death, since he was able to easily force back Lang Tiao and Yunjilan, presumably his cultivation was still there. It should not be difficult for him to hear clearly what had happened in this room. The Northern Qi Emperor was a woman. It was one thing for Fan Xian to know this secret. After all, he was the little emperor's first and second, and perhaps the only man in her life. If other people knew, the little emperor didn't know what terrifying fate would await her after she lost all standing and reputation. Under such a powerful impact, her face only became solemn and not deathly pale. This was already extraordinary and extremely valiant. Fan Xian did not look at her expression. With a slight smile, he brought the hot water to the side of the bed and began to help her scrub. He knew it was difficult for her to move. After this night, the distance between the two of them had long reached a negative. It was not just physically, but also psychologically. During these short intervals, the two guests of the sword hut did not have anything else to do. Other than combing their hair, holding hands, and picking at their palms and thighs, they could only talk. They talked about each other's strange lives, their childhoods that were different from everyone else in the world, how men dressed as women, how men looked like women, how they deceived the world to gain fame, how they sat on the throne, how they bathed, how they copied poetry, and so on. The little emperor and Fan Xian were equals. They seriously discussed each other's lives to see what things the other had done inappropriately. From the other's wisdom, they searched for an opportunity to make up for it. The night passed. The two of them had not yet turned white, but they were like old friends. They had not yet turned white, but their hearts were set. Other than the rubbing of the man and woman's bodies, there was also a kind of spiritual connection and comfort, as well as an exceptionally stimulating feeling of challenge, rippling through their hearts. The little emperor pulled up the thin blanket to cover her chest and stared at Fan Xian. Lowering her voice, she said angrily, "What if Sigurd finds out? I have said many times to be gentler." Hearing these words, Fan Xian, who had put down the basin of water and was drinking tea to moisten his throat, almost spat it out. He walked to the side of the bed and gently grabbed her chin to stroke it. In an even voice, he said, the old man is about to die. Even if he guesses something, we won't admit it. What is there to be afraid of? The situation was very strange. The little emperor coldly slapped his hand down and said, if my identity is exposed, you know how big of a disaster it will be. Fan Xian fell silent. He knew that if the news that the Northern Qi Emperor was a woman got out, the world would probably fall into chaos. The Qing kingdom would not let go of this opportunity and would certainly use it to send out troops. I've said many times that you have to trust me and cooperate with me. Leave all future matters to me. He placed his hands on the little emperor's bare shoulders and pressed them down slightly. In a sincere and unquestionable tone, he spoke. The aces outside the sword hut had already endured an entire night. The torches were gradually extinguished. Lang Tiao and the other Northern Qi aces stared coldly at the door of the sword hut. They didn't know how the emperor was inside and if he had suffered any harm. If he was not worried about Fan Xian or Sigurd going crazy, Lang Tiao would not have waited patiently outside the hut. He would have long let everyone in. Sigurd had already expressed his attitude. The disciples of the sword hut did not charge in, but they were shocked. They didn't know what had happened in the hut during this long night. As time passed, the patience of the people outside grew thinner and thinner. Yun Jilan silently watched Lang Tiao's gaze. He knew that if the sword hut still didn't give an explanation, they would immediately attack the hut again. In a few days, the Northern Qi army would probably also enter Dongyi. Since my teacher has made his stance clear, he will not let the emperor suffer any harm. Even if he is with Fan Xian, my teacher will not allow the Qing people to show any disrespect to the emperor in his eyes. Yun Jilan said in a heavy voice. Lang Tiao's mood relaxed slightly. Given Sigurd grandmaster position and the situation in Dongyi, he would not just watch as his emperor was humiliated. After all, it was Sigurd who had invited them to open the hut. Lang Tiao was no longer worried about the emperor's safety. He had not thought that in one night, the emperor had already been bullied into a woman. Sigurd that strange old creature, would not just watch as Fan Xian killed the Northern Qi Emperor. If the Northern Qi Emperor and Fan Xian were willing to fight and create chaos, this great grandmaster would not be able to do anything. Chapter 637. I am truly amazing. Yesterday, it was 6,666 words again. A strange smile flashed and disappeared. Shock floated in this great grandmaster's eyes. Logically speaking, a grandmaster should have experienced countless earth-shattering events in his life. Even if Dong Mountain had collapsed in front of him, it probably would not have made his eyelids blink. However, this shock was clear. Fan Xian had been looking into Sigurd eyes the entire time, so he was able to accurately grasp the thoughts in this figure's heart. Other than smiling bitterly to himself, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The reason he had been looking into Sigurd eyes the entire time was because there was nowhere else on Sigurd body to look at. This short old man was sitting in a wheelchair. The bones on the left side of his face were broken and deeply sunken in. His left arm was broken as well. His sleeves were empty and fluttered in the wind. Although the large hemp clothes covered his body and the extent of his injuries was unknown, it was still a particularly frightening sight to think about. This was the first time in Fan Xian's life that he had seen Sigurd the most valiant person in the world, the sword saint who had protected Dongyi for decades. In his imagination, this grandmaster-level figure, even if he was not as ethereal as an immortal, would at least have a sense of transcendence. However, he had not expected that the Sigurd who appeared in front of him would be like this. It was wretched and pitiful. Only his eyes were filled with a natural ruthlessness and an unyielding sword intent. Fan Xian could only stare into his eyes, terrified that he would be disrespectful. The atmosphere in the room was very strange. Facing a legendary figure, Fan Xian should have appeared more excited. However, he could not become excited no matter what. Perhaps it was because he knew the other person was going to die in a few days, perhaps it was because he had lived with Uncle Wu Zhu since he was young, or perhaps it was because his parents were both incredible people no less than great grandmasters. The sword boy pushed the wheelchair into the morning light. The faint light clearly illuminated the terrifying wound on Siga Jian's face. The sword boy obediently retreated. It was Siga Jian who broke the silence first. After staring at Fan Xian for a moment, he sighed in a raspy voice, "Admirable, admirable." This great grandmaster had the reputation of being an idiot since he was a child. After he had mastered his swordsmanship, he moved unhindered between heaven and earth. He never had any thoughts of bending his waist. He pierced through the sky and pierced through the earth. He was very arrogant. Even on Dong Mountain, when he had been grievously injured by the Qing Emperor and Yi Liuyun's combined attack, he was still stubborn and laughed to his heart's content. He refused to lower his head. He was the most powerful person in the world. It was basically impossible for him to feel admiration for someone. Thus, when he repeatedly expressed his admiration for Fan Xian's face couldn't help but redden. He was rather embarrassed. Fan Xian knew what this admiration meant. He did not admire the Qing Emperor or Yi Luyun, but he admired him. It was because of the voices that had come out last night. "You're welcome, you're welcome." He coughed to hide his embarrassment and turned around. The morning light shone down, enveloping both the old man and the young man. Fan Xian naturally and habitually stood by the side of the wheelchair. He furrowed his brows slightly as he felt this scene. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. The pitiful short and thin injured person on the chair was the legendary tyrannical and murderous Siga Jian. The sunlight shone through Siga Jian's brows and glowed with a white light. It was as if his brows had suddenly turned white. Fan Xian stared in a daze at the other side of the face that was still intact. He suddenly realized that this great grandmaster was not as old as he had imagined. 3 years ago, when Fan Xian had fled Dong Mountain, only Yi Luyun had been on the boat. Regardless of whether it was Ku He or Siga Jian, he had not encountered either of them. Of course, if he had encountered them at that time, he probably would not have been able to escape back to Jingdou. Thus, he did not know what had happened on the mountain at the time. He did not see the wretched sight of a sword light shining through the jade peak, killing all the tiger guards, and blood covering the mountain path. But this did not affect his faint fear of Siga Jian. He knew that this great grandmaster was somewhat crazy. If he could kill 100 tiger guards, he could easily kill him. Fan Xian had never met Siga Jian before, but he was no stranger to this great grandmaster. After he entered Jingdou, Dongyi's sword hut had become the Overwatch Council, eldest princess, and even the Qin court and emperor's favorite scapegoat. In any case, this great grandmaster did not leave the sword hut, so he could only allow the Qin kingdom's shameless people to pour dirty water on him. Because of the eldest princess, the Overwatch Council led by Fan Xian and Dongyi's sword hut had carried out a life and death battle during those years. Starting from the Battle of Nilon Street, they both saw each other as enemies and each used their own methods. It was only when Fan Xian went to Jiangnan and used the power of the shadow that he managed to chase Yunjilan and his people back. Fan Xian knew that this was because Siga Jian had always disdained to deal with him. If he had truly wanted to kill him, perhaps he would have died many years ago. After this, Fan Xian successfully inherited the palace treasury. At this moment, Siga Jian appeared particularly like a mature politician and not an idiot with great martial power. Siga Jian put down his past grievances and sent his favorite last disciple, 13th Wang, to express his attitude to Fan Xian. Thus, Fan Xian was very familiar with Siga Jian. Or rather, he thought he was familiar with Siga Jian. Meeting him now, he realized that Siga Jian was still a stranger to him, an unfathomable and terrifying stranger with an unknown temperament. There seemed to be an invisible pressure in the sword hut emanating from the injured person in the wheelchair, making it difficult for Fan Xian to breathe. I didn't kill you back then not because I looked down on you, Siga Jian suddenly said mockingly in a hoarse voice. The reason I didn't kill you is simple. It's just that you don't know it. Once Siga Jian opened his mouth, the pressure filling the courtyard weakened slightly. Fan Xian relaxed and quickly said, please advise me. Your mother's surname is Yi. Isn't this reason clear? Siga Jian furrowed his brows. It seemed that he had not expected Fan Xian to be so stupid. He cursed angrily. Fan Xian shrugged. He truly couldn't understand this reason. He had not gone deep into the sword hut to catch up with Siga Jian. Rather, he wanted to talk about the future of Dongyi and the world. The number of people who had the right to discuss the world had gradually decreased. He was already dead. Yi Luyun had truly escaped. After the Dong Mountain incident, many people had died. In the sword hut, there was the Northern Qi Emperor, Fan Xian, and Siga Jian. They were all people who had the right to sit and discuss the world. I trust that you have already read the proposal I had 13th Wang bring back. Proposal was a new term. In the 4th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian had once had Fan Xizha write a proposal to open the Donbo bookstore. This year, he had also written one and given it to Siga Jian. He wanted to convince this strange and ruthless great-grandmaster to accept his proposal. I didn't read it, Siga Jian said indifferently. With these words, Fan Xian's heart was like a heavy blow. He didn't know what Siga Jian was thinking. He had thought he would be able to move Siga Jian a little with the proposal he had painstakingly drafted. If Siga Jian didn't even look at it, what was there to talk about? The Qing Kingdom's diplomatic group hasn't arrived yet. What are you in such a rush for? Siga Jian looked at him mockingly. Fan Xian fell silent. Suddenly, he said, in my letter last year, I reported to you that I had confidence in controlling Northern Qi. If you trust me, I can also preserve Dongyi's independence to the greatest degree. Siga Jian looked at him calmly. His twisted and sunken terrifying face contrasted with his calm eyes. It appeared particularly quiet, but there was a glimmer of a craziness that made one shiver. That kid is actually a woman. I had not expected it. That is why I said I admired you earlier. If you want to convince me that you have the ability to control the entire situation based on this, it seems to be a bit lacking, Siga Jian said in a raspy voice. Siga Jian mockingly said in a raspy voice, your father is not a normal person. If you can't satisfy him, how will you fool him? The Qing Emperor's request was to swallow Dongyi into his territory. Siga Jian knew that after his death, Dongyi and the surrounding vassal states would no longer be able to protect themselves. They could only wait for their fate of being swallowed. Since Northern Qi had come out to cause trouble, Dongyi would have to wait for the right price and hope to be able to preserve themselves as much as possible. These were in themselves two completely different directions. He had to satisfy both the emperor and Siga Jian. For Fan Xian, this was a difficult task. As the saying goes, follow your brother's feelings and lose your sister-in-law's. Even if the girls in the brothel benefited from both sides, it would be difficult for them to reach such a stage. The key was still Siga Jian. As long as he nodded, everything could be discussed. Fan Xian thought of this. Very naturally, he pushed the wheelchair and began to walk on the yellow dirt paths around the sword grave. He pushed the heavily injured Siga Jian to bask in the sun. Siga Jian closed his eyes and enjoyed the sunlight landing on his body. Suddenly, he said, "You're very skilled at pushing the wheelchair." You're better than those children. Why don't you stay and take care of me these few months? Fan Xian smiled and replied, it's fine to take care of you for a few months. However, you have to look at those things. The tens of thousands of people in Dongyi are all looking at you and waiting for you. You have to have some ideas. As for pushing the wheelchair, I'm used to pushing it in Jingdo. Oh, I remember. That old dog's leg was broken a long time ago. Sigurd suddenly sighed. During these 20 years, the biggest mistake I made was actually getting the wrong target. I had always seen your emperor as my biggest target. I had never thought that if I had killed Qin Pingping at the beginning, perhaps your emperor would not be so arrogant. There was a powerful confidence hidden in the calm words. It was as if Sigurd Jian could kill such a terrifying figure as the director of the Overwatch Council if he wanted to. For some reason, the sea breeze around the sword grave paused slightly. Following the sword intent in Sigurd Jian's words, Fan Xian's heart felt as if it had been stabbed ruthlessly. His face became deathly pale. Only now did he feel the true realm of a great grandmaster. With a thought, the surrounding environment also reacted. Killing intent rose and was difficult to bear. His hands pressed forcefully against the back of the wheelchair, forcefully supporting himself. With great difficulty, he said, given your cultivation, if you focused on killing Director Qin, he would not be able to live for long. The problem is, if you killed him, Yi Luyun would come to kill the people of Dongyi. He breathed with difficulty for a moment and then slowly said, even if everyone in your family dies, you still have your disciple. Dongyi still has the manner of the master of the city. Sir Sword Saint, just as the emperor said, strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. Since you have appeared, then you cannot act recklessly. You are just a dead object to maintain the balance. That makes sense, Sigurd Jian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian continued to smile with difficulty. Sometimes, I feel fortunate on behalf of the people under heaven. Regardless of whether it is Master Ku he or you, there will always be things on your mind, such as Northern Qi and Dongyi. If you were truly an idiot who did things according to your own preferences but also had the power of a great grandmaster, I'm afraid the entire world would fall into chaos. Of course, he said with emphasis. If that was the case, I would not vainly hope to convince you of anything. Sigurd Jian was silent for a long time. He then suddenly opened his mouth and said, last night, you gave me many surprises. So, your so-called trump card is on that little emperor. I admit that you have the right to negotiate with me. I also admit that I do care about Dongyi's future. Perhaps this is a habit that I will take with me even if I die. I am used to protecting the people of this city. He turned his head and said in a raspy voice, as long as you satisfy me, I will also satisfy you. Surrender in name, garrison, unchanged for 50 years. Fan Xian's heart beat faster. Looking into his eyes, he threw out a few words with unusual speed. When he was in Qingzhou, he had already said these words to 13th Wang. Now, he was just repeating them in front of Sigurd Jian. Garrison. Sigurd Jian laughed. His laughter was particularly sharp and pierced Fan Xian's eyes with a sharp pain. No matter how he used Xinqi to protect his body, he was unable to block it. His face was deathly pale. With a muffled grunt, he cursed, you won't kill me. What is the meaning of torturing me like this? Hearing these words, Sigurd Jian involuntarily shrugged and said, I'm just laughing out of habit. What does it have to do with torturing? The Northern Qi Emperor is actually a woman. TSK. Sigurd Jian seemed to have not heard Fan Xian's suggestion at all. He was still immersed in this reality. It was as if he was happy that he had finally learned a certain secret before he died. Fan Xian finally realized the strangeness of this great grandmaster's personality. In a flash, he remembered that Jean Daudu was still catching up on sleep in her room. He wondered if this great grandmaster had been eavesdropping all night. His expression became strange. He unconsciously looked under Sigurd eyes to see if he had deep dark circles or corns. Sigurd also looked over. Looking at the dark circles around Fan Xian's eyes, he furrowed his brows and said, "Even if it's a female emperor who only does it once every few years, you have to take it easy. If you want to die from indulgence, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to." After these words were said, Fan Xian was greatly embarrassed. However, a thought flashed through his mind. He heard the last sentence clearly. His lips trembled slightly. He didn't know how to respond. The morning light gradually brightened and cast the shadow of the wheelchair on the sword grave. It was like it was pierced by countless swords. It looked very pitiful. Fan Xian looked calmly at the shadow and suddenly thought of the familiar figure he had seen behind the second door when he had been chased by Lang Tiao and Yunjilan. At that time, he had even thought that person had come. Looking at the shadow in the sword grave, only then did he know his guess was wrong. At that time, the person who had appeared behind the second door was Sigurd himself. He had not thought that the feeling of him sitting in the wheelchair would be so similar to Chen Pingping's. Seeming to guess what he was thinking, Sigurd coldly said, "Under my eyes, no one can touch you." However, Fan Xian did not feel a sliver of safety. He looked calmly at Sigurd and quickly analyzed in his heart. Suddenly, he said, "No one can, but that doesn't mean no one dares." Yunjilan dared to put 13th Wang under house arrest, make a private deal with the Qi people, and chase after me in front of you. Although Sigurd had casually chased Yunjilan and Lang Tiao out of the hut and intimidated everyone, given his understanding of the great grandmaster realm, Sigurd did not need to appear behind the second door. His attack at the time only proved one thing. Sigurd present strength was no longer what it had been at its peak. "Right now, I cannot leave the hut because no one dares to push me." Sigurd gaze became strange. He had once again guessed Fan Xian's thoughts. "Your father and Yi Luyun have injured me too badly. I should have died a long time ago. Luckily, I've survived until now. However, I can no longer move. I can only sit in this damn wheelchair. Even if I want to kill people, I can't run anymore. As long as those people who want to be killed by me stay a bit further away from me, there's nothing I can do." A glimmer of sadness suddenly flashed through Fan Xian's heart. Such a great grandmaster had fallen to such a state in the end, sealing himself in the sword hut and unable to leave. "Of course, no one dares to try," Sigurd said with his eyes closed. "As long as you are by my side, you are still safe." Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and said, "How many more days can you live?" Sigurd abruptly opened his eyes. It was as if he had been angered by this bold question. His gaze pierced straight into the depths of Fan Xian's heart like a heavenly sword. Fan Xian's eyes felt a piercing pain. He quickly closed them. After a long time, Sigurd faintly said, "There's about 100 more days." Fan Xian opened his eyes. He didn't dare to look at this great grandmaster who had difficulty controlling his emotions. Sigurd stared in a daze at the deep pit under his feet and the sword swaying in the wind. He tilted his ear to listen to the crisp clanging sounds. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he was thinking of the countless beautiful scenes in this life, the countless times he had attacked with the sword, the countless victories, and the people who had died under his sword. His expression gradually became dim. He had only lost once in his life, on Dong Mountain. However, he had lost so thoroughly that he had no choice but to carry on such a humiliating conversation with a junior beside the sword pit. I once relied on the sword in my hand to control Dongyi and the countless vassal states around it, Sigurd suddenly said coldly. Sigurd suddenly said coldly, only in the last moments of my life did I realize that the only things I could control were this grass hut and this pit. Fan Xian lowered his head and bowed deeply. He knew that Sigurd had finally made up his mind. This bow is to thank the Sword Saint for his mercy on behalf of the Qing soldiers and the people of Dongyi. No need to thank me. Sigurd suddenly laughed self-mockingly and said, if the person from the Qing kingdom had not been you, I would not have agreed. Fan Xian smiled and thought, the Northern Qi Emperor had come thousands of li, yet you avoided meeting him. This meant that you already had a plan in your heart. Why did you have to say such things? The present situation was set. If Sigurd wanted Dongyi to avoid the disaster of war, there was only one path. Sigurd looked at the happy young man beside him. His mood was also strange. He had to admit that although this kid's strength was lacking, his luck was not bad. He was able to use one night to solve most of the biggest problem, the pressure on Northern Qi. He smiled again in his heart. This young man still didn't know why his attitude was always there. Sigurd really wanted to see Fan Xian's angry expression when he solved the problem at the last moment. However, at that time, perhaps he would already be dead. He thought gloomily. He then turned his head and looked at Fan Xian. You have to believe me. If it wasn't for you, even if your emperor personally came to beg me on his knees, I would still not agree to the Qing kingdom's conditions. Fan Xian did not understand. Chapter 638. The monthly votes are 250 votes away from third place. It is truly an unlucky number. Everyone, please help me move up a little more, a little more. Thank you. What is your mother's surname? My mother's surname is Yi. Before coming to Dongyi, Fan Xian had expected that he would certainly run into people, matters, or past related to the old Yi family. He knew that after his mother, Yi Qingmei, came to this world, her first stop was Dongyi. On the night he was 16, Uncle Wu Zhu had told him everything about Yi Qingmei for the first time, everything that this amnesiac remembered. The Yi family's business began in Dongyi. The first fortune they seized in the world was also in Dongyi. Later, for some reason, Yi Qingmei chose the Qing kingdom, which was not very powerful at the time. Perhaps, it could be said that she chose the unusually powerful emperor. Yi Qingmei left Dongyi. Fan Xian didn't know if she ever returned. He knew that this large city must have been very important to her. However, he had not thought that Sigurd would suddenly bring up the past and use such an awkward and crude excuse. Forget it, forget it. Fan Xian glanced at Sigurd and smiled bitterly. I know what you want to say. However, she is she, and I am me. Can it be split open? Is your mother willing to see Dongyi, which she once fought for, become something no different from any other county in the Qing kingdom? Sigurd smiled mockingly. One cannot forget one's roots. You are her son. You are also a Dongyi person. Fan Xian raised his brows and simply sat down in the empty space beside the wheelchair. His two legs dangled in the sword grave, swinging around emptily. With a cold smile, he said, although I did not personally see what happened on Dong Mountain, I still know some details. I have also heard the words you once said to Uncle Wu Zhu. You want me to be the master of Dongyi? Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at Sigurd. With slight mockery, he said, just because I am half a Dongyi person. Did you think of such a response after hiding in the sword hut for so long? Don't forget, in the end, I am a Qing person. My relationship with the emperor has already been decided. Don't expect to use your identity as the city lord to stir up his majesty's suspicions and force me to break off relations with him. He waved his arm and said calmly, "Impossible. Of course, I will not be the master of Dongyi." Sigurd coldly said, "You are so afraid of death. Of course, you are afraid that your emperor will kill you. I have never hoped that you would take over Dongyi. I am only reminding you that you do not need to innately think for the benefit of the Qing people. I am only comforting you. Even if you think for Dongyi, it is not a treasonous thing. I have thought enough on behalf of the people of Dongyi." Fan Xian did not budge an inch. "The words I said earlier, do you think that other than me, who would give up so many benefits? Who would risk His Majesty's wrath to persuade him to accept these conditions? This is enough." Sigurd closed his eyes and slowly said, "Perhaps, you've never thought about how your mother died." In the depths of the sword hut, countless swords in the large pit began to tremble at the same time. They gave off a mournful cry and trembled endlessly. It was as if they would all break in the next moment. Fan Xian's legs, which were suspended in the sword grave, also stopped moving in this instant. A serious expression gradually appeared between his brows. An indescribable emotion rose in his eyes. There was no one around. Given Sigurd realm, he was not worried that someone would eavesdrop. However, Fan Xian still felt his heart begin to tighten. With each twitch, it was difficult to resist the pain. He took a deep breath. His face was unnaturally white. In a quiet voice, he said, "Or perhaps, do you have any ideas that can convince others?" "No," Sigurd said coldly. Sigurd coldly said, "I am only guessing. How could someone like your mother die so mysteriously? If a pig-headed empress of the Qin kingdom or that old whore the Empress Dowager could kill your mother, then your mother would not be your mother. Just like that." He also guessed. Chen Pingping also guessed. "Why can't I guess?" Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. In a quiet voice, he said, "It's best not to talk about guessing. It will kill someone." "Is that so?" Sigurd suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was filled with endless viciousness and mockery. "It is rare to see someone as afraid of death as you." Fan Xian knew what he was looking down on. Without changing his expression, he said, "To be able to easily kill one's entire family, such a person is rare." Sigurd expression changed. A ruthless light appeared in his eyes. It was as if he could attack and kill Fan Xian at any moment. A heart-rending sword intent began to spread through the air again. This time, Fan Xian did not seem to feel anything. He glanced at him disdainfully and said, "If you did it, then you did it. Are you afraid of people talking about it? As for me, you don't need to worry about my matters." He furrowed his brows tightly and sighed helplessly. "Sometimes, I truly don't understand what you important figures, old creatures, are thinking. Why must you push me to the opposite side of the Emperor? Do you really think I have the power to oppose him? Most importantly, do you really think that I'm willing to resist him?" He looked at Sigurd angry eyes and shook his head. "No matter what, he is still my father, so I don't understand what you people think." "Father." Sigurd shrunk his body into the wheelchair. His entire person was like a sharp sword that had returned to its sheath. There was no longer any light. "If I really get angry, I can kill both father and mother." Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He thought to himself that there was truly no need to discuss such things as human ethics with this idiot. As for the true cause of Yi Qingmei's death, at the most crucial moment of the Jingdou rebellion, before the eldest princess died, she had pointed it out to Fan Xian. Chen Pingping's actions, whether intentional or not, seemed to prove this point. However, Chen Pingping did not say it clearly. Minister Fan also did not say it clearly. After these two old comrades, who had personally experienced this matter, suspected each other for many years. They finally set their sights on a certain person. However, they did not want to tell Fan Xian this matter clearly. Other than Sigurd Jian, who feared nothing and only wanted to see the Qin kingdom go into trouble, no one tried to lead Fan Xian onto a path of no return just because of speculation. You are about to die. Don't hope to see the Qin kingdom fall into internal chaos before you die. Fan Xian nodded his head slightly. It was as if he wanted to convince Sigurd Jian and himself. Accept my sincerity and peacefully wait for your death. I will look after the millions of people in Dongyi well for you. Sigurd Jian stared coldly in front of him for a long time. He then said, believe me, one day, you will walk the path that the wretched heavens have arranged for you. I am going to defy the heavens. Fan Xian said with a loud laugh. He laughed until he began to cough. His face flushed red and he cut a wretched figure. Sigurd Jian glanced at him disdainfully. Fan Xian was angered by this gaze. Gritting his teeth, he said in an icy voice, regardless of whether it is Ku He or you, it seems that before they died, they all placed their hopes on me. Is this not a ridiculous thing in itself? This is not the will of heaven. It is just the selfish thoughts of you major figures. Selfish? Sigurd Jian shook his head. I don't know what that old baldy did before he died. Fan Xian shrugged and said, he sent his best disciple to Jingdo to extend Chen Pingping's life. It looks like he is counting on Chen Pingping to become the cause of internal chaos in the Qin kingdom. Ha 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 ha. Sigurd Jian couldn't resist roaring with laughter. As he laughed, he cursed, so, that's what that damn baldy thinks. It looks like he is counting on the Qing Emperor and Chen Pingping to make a huge ruckus. You will be stuck in the middle, unable to be a person, and then he will force you to go crazy. Your judgment is not bad. He is the same as me. We both place our hopes on you. However, Sigurd Jian twisted his neck and said disdainfully, Ku He is too stupid. It would have been better to directly force you on such a matter. Why go through Chen Pingping? Ku He underestimated that old dog's loyalty to the Qing Emperor. Please, I am right in front of you. Isn't it a bit boring for you to directly force me to rebel? As Fan Xian sighed, he pointed at the large pit in front of him and the sword that appeared particularly old after being weathered by the wind and rain. I clearly know that there is a pit in front of me. Am I still going to jump in? Sigurd Jian did not directly answer this question. He shrunk his body and said, actually, regardless of whether or not you admit that you are a Dongyi person, I am not too worried about the stupid people in this city. Don't forget, Miss Ning is an Eastern barbarian through and through. That first prince of yours can't be like you and refuse to admit his origins. Fan Xian shrugged. He knew what he said was correct. The emperor only had 3 sons left. 2 of the grown ones had too many ties to Dongyi. If the Qin kingdom truly sent troops to attack, it would indeed be troublesome. The most important problem is that there are many pits in one's life. You clearly know that it is in front of you, but you have no choice but to jump in with your eyes wide open. Sigurd Jian pursed his lips and pointed one arm toward the depths of the sword pit. His entire body was mixed with the aura of an old man and an irresistible pressure. Faintly, he said, 3 years ago, I told Jilan that even though I knew that there was a pit in front of me, I was still going to jump in. He was talking about the Dong Mountain matter. Regardless of whether it was Ku He or Sigurd Jian, before they set off to assassinate the emperor, they had both thought about it countless times. They had both suspected that it was a pit. However, time waited for no one. The situation was pressing. The 2 great grandmasters had no choice but to jump. They had fallen wretchedly. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then said, there's nothing more to say about these things. After the diplomatic group arrives, what needs to be done has to be done. You don't need to worry about my matters. So, shouldn't we talk about happier things right now? Happier? Sigurd suddenly cursed angrily. I am about to die. I haven't left this broken hut in 2 years. How can I be happy? Oh, you are truly pitiful. Although your cultivation is there, it is difficult for you to move. You don't dare to casually leave the hut and have been forced to sit for years by your eldest disciple, Fan Xian said mockingly. Fan Xian laughed mockingly and said, back then, King Wei Ling was starved to death by his own son in the Li Palace. If Yun Jilan also did the same thing, you, a great grandmaster, would die too unsightly a death. I am not useless like King Wei Ling Wang. Sigurd eyes were sunken and suffused with a cold light. I just don't want to go out. What does that have to do with Jilan? Sitting in a wheelchair in the sun is indeed a pitiful feeling of being old and about to die. However, you have to get used to it. Fan Xian knew he was speaking the truth. Even if he was a great grandmaster about to die, if he wanted to leave the hut, who dared to stop him? Who could stop him? That makes sense. Sigurd suddenly lowered his head to glance at him. The sun is pretty good today. Why don't you push me out for a walk? Fan Xian froze where he stood. He didn't know how many aces were watching him covetously outside the sword hut. Even if Sigurd spoke to protect him, walking in Dongyi, the difficulty was a bit too great. The Northern Qi Emperor is still in the hut, he said quietly with his head lowered. Isn't that your woman? Let's walk around together. Sigurd coughed and called over a child. He went to the room to invite the Northern Qi Emperor out. Before long, the little emperor, who had already put on her clothes, slowly walked over from the other side of the sword grave. From a distance, she saw Sigurd sitting in a wheelchair, as well as Fan Xian sitting rudely by the sword grave. The clothes from last night had long been torn. The sword hut had prepared well. The little emperor, Jean Daodu, was wearing light green clothing. It did not look seductive at all. It only had the aura of a weak scholar. Coming to their side, the little emperor smiled slightly and said in a low voice, "It is indeed difficult to see the sword saint's face." Sigurd tilted his head slightly and rudely did not reply to this question. Instead, he waved his hand and chased the child far away. After a long time, the corners of his lips twitched. Looking at the Northern Qi Emperor, he quietly said, "Greetings, Your Majesty." The sword saint is too polite. The little emperor's gaze didn't even glance at Fan Xian sitting on her. This kind of composure was truly first-rate in the world. However, her calm exterior was easily broken by Sigurd. This great grandmaster smiled and gazed at the Northern Qi Emperor with a complicated expression. In a raspy voice, he said, "There is nothing good to see an old creature like me. However, a female emperor is the first in 1,000 years. I am very happy to be able to see Your Majesty with my own eyes." After these words were said, the Northern Qi Emperor's expression immediately changed. She stared angrily and coldly at Fan Xian. However, Fan Xian did not have any reaction. Sigurd gazed at the little emperor and said with a slight smile, "First, I already know that Your Majesty is a woman. Second, I am about to die and won't go around telling people. I am a strange person who likes to keep candy in my own box and not share it with others." Sigurd didn't look at the little emperor, whose expression changed endlessly. He continued in a quiet voice, "Third, because I am about to die, we can speak more directly between us. Earlier, I was urging Fan Xian to rebel. I wonder if Your Majesty is interested in this suggestion." The little emperor took a deep breath and forcefully pushed down the slight fear and unease in her heart. Calmly, she said, I am very interested in this suggestion. If Sir Fan Jr.'s rebellion fails, you can come live in Northern Qi. I also think so. Regardless of whether it is being the master of the city or a male empress, presumably it is both more comfortable than being the Qing emperor's servant. However, he is not willing to agree. Fan Xian sat by the edge of the pit beside the sword grave and said, a scholar's rebellion cannot be accomplished in 10 years. Don't you know that I am the most famous scholar in the world? Yes. Sigurd smiled strangely and looked at the little emperor. That is why we have decided not to continue this topic. Instead, we are going to the seaside in the city for a walk. I wonder if your majesty is interested. Can I say no? The little emperor asked angrily. Fan Xian replied from below, of course not. Sigurd was the god of Dongyi. Regardless of whether it was actively or passively, a distance was always maintained between gods. It was clear that this great grandmaster in the wheelchair had not come out to casually look at the street view in many years. His entire being appeared to be rather excited. Fan Xian and the little emperor walked slowly behind the wheelchair. Occasionally, they would glance at each other but didn't speak. They were actually very shocked that the three of them had so easily left the sword hut without the sword hut and Northern Qi aces discovering any trace. Even if it was Sigurd, it still shocked Fan Xian that he could do this. Walking through the streets and alleys of Dongyi, Fan Xian could clearly sense that no one was following them. Given Sigurd's realm, if someone followed them for more than a moment, they would probably immediately be hacked into countless balls of blood by the rootless sword intent on the wheelchair. The three of them came to a large tree on the outskirts of the city. The tree crown stretched out widely. The green color blocked out the sky and sun. They rested there, hiding from the blazing sun. Chapter 639. Happy birthday to Master Yuan. I was forced to do this. In the depths of spring, all kinds of trees were stretching their branches and spitting out green leaves. Dongyi was close to the seashore. The moist sea breeze blew day and night, making spring come earlier and fiercer here than in other places. The period of time for spring to accumulate was also longer. No one knew how many years this big green tree on the outskirts of the city had been growing here. The trunk was tall and straight, but it did not have the intention of piercing the sky. Countless green leaves gathered at the crown of the tree to form a large canopy, appearing exceptionally beautiful and benevolent. It blocked the sun in the sky, casting a shadow over the people entering and exiting the city. This tree was very large. The area of its shadow was several mu of land. Many people were resting under the tree. Under the tree were roots that protruded from the soil. They were like the thick body of a dragon, steady and solid. Sigurd, Fan Xian, and the little emperor rested temporarily beside these roots. This strange combination did not attract the attention of passers-by. It was probably because there had always been many strange people in Dongyi. Fan Xian sat on the tree root and felt the shade under his butt. He didn't know what kind of tree the tree behind him was and couldn't be bothered to investigate. He only lowered his head to look for ants or dung-killing cockroaches moving balls of dung. He didn't find anything. How old was she at that time? 5 or 6? 7 or 8? Sigurd sat in the wheelchair and furrowed his brows. He thought for a long time. It seemed that because of the passage of time, his memory had become blurry. He spat on the ground and said, in any case, it was just a little girl. How old were you at that time? I should have been in my teens. Sigurd scratched his head. You know, my brain has never been very good. It's always hard for me to remember such complicated questions. I don't think my age is a complicated question, Fan Xian said. Geniuses are always different from others in certain areas, Sigu Jian said with a cold smile. He clearly did not care about Fan Xian's mockery. The other side of a genius is an idiot. Fan Xian glanced at him lazily. Of course, everyone knows you were an idiot when you were young. Sigu Jian didn't say anything. He only met Fan Xian's gaze. He tried to find some shadow of his past in the crevices of the tree roots. The little Emperor Jean Daodu stood coldly to the side, looking at the old man and the young man's stupidity. She felt disapproval in her heart. The three of them had traveled peacefully. Based on the theories of the secular world, the little emperor's status was the most noble. It was clear that neither Sigu Jian nor Fan Xian cared much about this. Sigu Jian and Fan Xian seemed to be interested in looking for ants. They stayed the entire time under the large tree the entire time. It was as if they of the green were to die. The little emperor furrowed her brows slightly. She thought about how the officials outside the sword hut were probably still worried about her. Additionally, she didn't know what would happen next. She was also worried whether or not the two of them would reveal her fate. Feeling slightly worried, she quietly said, "Lady Yi is no longer here. Even if you watch her for another 3 years, you cannot hope for her to come back to life." These words seemed to be stating a matter, but they were also somewhat heart-wrenching. The little emperor's intelligence and reaction speed were fully displayed at this moment. In the sword hut, Sigu Jian had only briefly mentioned the matter of persuading Fan Xian to rebel. She had caught onto some vague clues and tried to point it out. With these words, Sigu Jian and Fan Xian both raised their heads and glanced at her, making her feel a little flustered. Fan Xian shrugged and said, "I just think ants are more interesting than people." Sigu Jian looked at Fan Xian and sighed in admiration. "When your mother accompanied me to find ants, someone asked us this. She also answered this way." Following Sigu Jian's joyful narration, Fan Xian smiled. The scene from many years ago seemed to rise before his eyes. An idiot with a runny nose squatting under a big tree, watching ants moving and fighting. He might even untie the belt around his waist and pee on the ant nest. The passers-by and residents of Dongyi all knew the identity of this idiot. When they passed him, they all had expressions of pity and disgust in their eyes, but no one was willing to go up and talk to him. Then, a blind young servant holding the hand of a little girl came from afar to Dongyi. They came to this big tree and found the idiot who was so focused that he didn't care what was happening around him. The little girl, who was carved from jade, squatted curiously by the idiot's side and asked, "What are you looking at?" The idiot glanced at her impatiently and said, "I'm looking at ants." The little girl made an "oh" sound and began to accompany him in looking at ants. They watched for a long time. Finally, someone at the side couldn't stand it anymore and reminded the young servant that this idiot was the young master of a major family in the city. He was just an idiot. Don't let your young mistress be stupid with him. After the little girl heard these words, she didn't stand up. She smiled and said, "I just feel that, sometimes, ants are more interesting than people." It was clear that the meaning hidden in these words was much more mature than the age this little body showed. However, the passers-by and people under the tree didn't notice this. They just wondered whose family this young mistress belonged to. She was so pretty and clean, like a fairy who had walked out of a painting. She was squatting with the most famous idiot of the master of the city. They couldn't bear to watch any longer. The little girl waved her hand. The blind young servant, who had been as cold as a block of ice, also squatted down beside the two of them. Although he didn't want to squat, there was no difference between squatting and standing. Since she wanted him to squat, then he would squat. At that time, there were 3 of us. Sigu Jian was continuing his memories. He scratched his slightly itchy face and said in a raspy voice, "We watched the ants fight for half a day. Then, I invited them to my home as guests." "Your home?" "My stupid father used to be the master of Dongi. Don't you know?" "Oh, I've heard of it. However, that was many years ago. Your stupid father died to your sword a long time ago." I didn't think of it right away. The manor of the master of the city was very large and luxurious. Sigurd suddenly opened his mouth and smiled. "But the place I lived in was like a dog kennel because I was an idiot. My stupid father hated me the most. Furthermore, my mother was only a serving girl. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I've read many similar novels." Fan Xian nodded. No one in Dongi dared to discuss Sigurd past, but it didn't mean the Overwatch Council didn't do research in this area. He had a clear understanding of Sigurd past. He knew what kind of humiliating and belittling the idiot had lived in the manor of the master of the city. However, it was only now that he learned that Sigurd birth mother was a serving girl. That serving girl had probably died many years ago. "Your mother and Wu Zhu were the first friends I made in my life," Sigurd suddenly said seriously. "Although the place I lived in was terrible and I couldn't even bring out a cup of tea, they didn't look down on me and still went with me. Perhaps it was because I was an idiot at the time, so I didn't think there was a problem. But, it was clear that many people in the manor thought there was a problem. They could not accept two people of unknown origins living in the manor, particularly with the idiot young master." After a few days, Yi Zi and Wu Zhu left the manor. I didn't mind. In any case, I had to go out during the day to see ants. On the way, I would go to the room they rented to play. This is truly the first time I learned that you once had such interactions with my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu. Sigurd furrowed his brows and said in a cold voice, "Did Wu Zhu never mention to you what happened in Dongi?" "No." Fan Xian sat on a tree root and picked up a thin branch. Unconsciously picking at the dirt, he replied, "Later on, my memory became much worse." "Oh, Wu Zhu, this kid, his memory actually deteriorated?" Sigurd suddenly laughed loudly. "Isn't that similar to my idiotic appearance back then?" Fan Xian glared at him. Shortly after, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. "Do you know where my mother and Uncle Wu Zhu came from?" This was something that had troubled him for a dozen years. Although he could vaguely guess a little and Xiao An had mentioned it a little before his death in the precipice of Shi Mountain outside Shangjing, Xiao An's narration before his death only explained his mother's origins and did not mention Uncle Wu Zhu. In Xiao An's narration, he and Ku he had suffered thousands of li and entered the outskirts of the temple. Then, they had seen Yi Qingmei. The two of them had rescued Yi Qingmei from the temple but had been separated halfway. At that time, Yi Qingmei was only 4 years old. It had been 2 years or even longer since Sigurd had seen her in Dongi. During this time, what had Yi Qingmei been doing? How had Uncle Wu Zhu come to her side? In Xiaowen's memories, he had once mentioned that Yi Qingmei seemed to be deeply worried about someone in the temple. She could not let it go, so she left decisively. Was that person Uncle Wu Zhu? Hearing Fan Xian's question, Sigurd suddenly became very quiet. A moment later, he faintly said, "At that time, it was impossible for me to know where they came from or where they were going. Later, I slowly found out." He turned his head slightly and stared at Fan Xian with his unfathomably calm eyes. "Do you still not know where Wu Zhu came from?" Fan Xian lowered his head and was silent for a long time. Uncle Wu Zhu was a strange creature. Uncle Wu Zhu would not age. Uncle Wu Zhu did not know internal strength. Uncle Wu Zhu was very good and powerful. So, Uncle Wu Zhu. He laughed bitterly and said, "Even if Uncle Wu Zhu came from the temple, what about my mother?" Nonsense. The blind man is an emissary of the temple. Your mother is his mistress. Of course, she is a fairy of the temple. Otherwise, how could she have done so much on her own? Sigurd scolded irritably. It was as if he felt that Fan Xian's question was unnecessary. However, Fan Xian did not feel that it was unnecessary. He smiled bitterly and thought that his mother, Yi Qingmei, was clearly like him. She had a soul that did not belong to this world. What relationship could she have with the temple? Fan Xian and Sigurd spoke energetically and sighed as they reminisced. Their voices naturally converged and did not affect anyone under the tree. The Northern Qi Emperor stood by the two of them the entire time, quietly listening to all of this. Her face gradually paled as the hands in her sleeves began to tremble. She didn't expect that she would be able to hear such a soul-stirring secret under this tree. She finally understood why a young man like Fan Xian, from the beginning of his time in the world, possessed a confidence and even arrogance that no one else in the world could match. He dared to be so disdainful of an emperor, sit on equal footing with a great grandmaster like Sigurd, shamelessly talk about the world, and try to control everything in his hands. The little emperor knew that Fan Xian's mother was Yi Qingmei. She also faintly knew that there was a blind great master behind him. It was not until now that she learned that the young lady of the Yi family and the blind great master had an inexplicable connection to the temple. What was the temple? It was a god that floated above the clouds in the sky, coldly watching the suffering of the mortal world without the slightest change in expression. It was a will that surpassed mortals. It was the legendary protector of the land. However, no one knew where the temple was or what it was, other than Master Ku He, who had seen it with his own eyes. Ku He kowtowed in front of the temple for 3 days and gained the abilities of a great grandmaster. Under the large tree, the young lady of the Yi family met Sigurd. Sigurd went from being an idiot with a runny nose to a warrior with unparalleled sword skills. Another example was the Qing Emperor. The little emperor's short eyelashes trembled uncontrollably. From the beginning of the Wei Kingdom until now, everyone in the world wanted to see the appearance of the temple with their own eyes. They wanted to find the shadow of the heavenly path in the illusory. Back then, the Wei Emperor had sent out thousands of troops to the north to search for the temple in order to live forever. Behind Fan Xian, there was the shadow of the temple. The Northern Qi Emperor glanced at Fan Xian's silhouette. Her heart was shocked and complicated. Fan Xian took a deep breath and said, "I should know a little about what happened later." After mother lived in Dongyi for a few years, she began to do business. That created the Yi family, as well as the present Qing palace treasury. No matter how things develop, it is never so simple. Sigurd raised his remaining arm and raised a finger. Even if Yi Qingmei was an immortal, she would not have been able to do what she did without any help. She needed someone to help her. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and looked at Sigurd. You? Me, Sigurd said coldly. Sigurd coldly said, "Although I am an idiot, I am, after all, the young master of the manor of the master of the city. As long as I control the manor of the master of the city, the Yi family business will be able to do as they please within Dongyi." "I understand." Fan Xian lowered his head. The chance encounter under the tree was not necessarily a chance encounter. To put it another way, before she entered Dongyi, she already knew the situation in the city. That is why she chose you. No, a chance encounter is a chance encounter, Sigurd said coldly. Sigurd coldly said, "At least, that is what I firmly believe. If she is looking for collaborators, there are many better than me. The things in her head are enough to attract countless riches. The existence of the blind man can ensure that she has no true enemies in this world. What were you doing in the years before you started your business?" Fan Xian did not argue with this question. I continued to look at ants and practice my swordplay. One day, Fei Jie, that poisonous old man, came. Siga Jian yawned. It seemed that the long hours of reminiscing had taken a toll on his mind. Oh, teacher said that the most glorious thing in his life was turning an idiot in Dongyi into a great grandmaster. Fan Xian smiled. Siga Jian smiled mockingly and said, "It is just that my mind is easily pedantic. I am not truly an idiot. What does becoming a great grandmaster have to do with Fei Jie?" Fan Xian's eyes and brows held a smile. Naturally, it has to do with my mother. Siga Jian was silent for a moment and then also smiled. Your mother was able to pass the martial method of Tianyi Dao to Ku He, so she could pass this sword method to me. However, I am a genius. Your mother's sword method was not very useful. What was truly useful was something I comprehended later on. You seem to be more narcissistic than I thought. Fan Xian shrugged. He knew that this great grandmaster was speaking the truth. Even if the Sigu sword method was one of the martial methods Yi Qingmei had stolen from the temple, it was impossible for a mortal to reach the realm of a great grandmaster unless one was a great genius, perseverance, and luck. There are many meanings to a genius. Siga Jian's eyelids drooped as if they could close at any moment and never open again. Your mother once said that my genius lies in focus and coldness. It is not easy to find someone who can watch ants move for 10 years, Siga Jian said in a raspy voice. Siga Jian said in a raspy voice, an idiot who uses thin branches to kill tens of thousands of ants is even harder to find. I was lucky to meet your mother and Wu Zhu. Your mother was also lucky to meet me in Dongyi. Fan Xian couldn't speak for a long time. He quietly savored these words. He thought to himself that decades ago, a storm had been brewing on the land. Who knows how many geniuses had appeared? Someone with Ku He's perseverance, Siga Jian's obsession, and the emperor's endurance. They had all appeared at that time. Then, Yi Qingmei had taken Uncle Wu Zhu and escaped from the temple and met these people. Regardless of realm, luck, talent, and willpower, in this world, no one could compare to these warriors who had not yet become great grandmasters. Haitang could not. Haitang could not. Her teacher dared to eat human flesh. Fan Xian could not. His old emperor could endure the unparalleled pain and despair of having his meridians shattered. 13th Wang could not either. His sword saint teacher did not care about human life at all. The young people of this time all had their flaws and inadequacies. This kind of difference would take many years and many setbacks to make up for. Only then would they be able to touch the layer of paper between heaven and man. Finally, they would leap over and become a true great grandmaster. Everything is fate. Fan Xian looked at Siga Jian and sighed. Siga Jian looked at Fan Xian with a strange expression and said, "Do you want to learn? If you want to learn, just say it." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He knew what this sword saint was preparing to teach him. A bitter smile rose involuntarily to his face. In a quiet voice, he said, "I think you already know." "I already know." Siga Jian coldly said, "I am talking about the true Siga Jian." Fan Xian's heart jumped. He was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he said, "In reality, there is no difference. The important thing is still the people. The young people of my generation still cannot compare to your generation. Of course, this kind of gap may slowly shrink. Even if you moved everything in the temple in front of me, what if I couldn't learn it?" His heart was filled with boundless emotions. It seemed that the martial secrets his mother had stolen from the temple back then had been passed on to these great grandmasters. Apart from Yi Liuyan's flowing cloud release hand, the origin of which was a little unclear, the others had already received sufficient proof. Outside the temple, he had paid the price of being heavily injured to save Yi Qingmei, who had only been 4 at the time. Then, he had obtained the price from Yi Qingmei's hands, which was now the supreme technique of Tianyi Dao. Although Sigurd sword technique was something he had comprehended himself with exceptional spiritual energy and stubbornness, it was clear that without the chance encounter under the large tree, an idiot would still be an idiot. If it could not be activated, how could he advance? As for the little yellow booklet that had always followed Fan Xian, the first volume was the tyrannical way, and the second was the kingly way. It had been with him for 20 years. Now, he understood that this was something his mother had left for the emperor. Then, somehow, through Wu Zhu's hands, the emperor had left it for him. It was the tyrannical martial method that made Fan Xian feel a sense of defeat. No matter what, he could not enter the realm of the kingly way. He had also learned Tianyi Dao's Xinqi method, but it did not help him in any way. Even if Sigurd truly had the so-called true Sigurd to pass on to him, what use would it be? The things Yi Qingmei had left behind in this world had already been gradually picked up by Fan Xian. One more seemed to be of no use. Back in the day, Yi Qingmei grew into a towering tree in Dongyi. I relied on the sword in my hand to obtain a position in Dongyi and become her partner in catching bugs by the side of this large tree, Sigurd said quietly with his eyes slightly closed. Sigurd closed his eyes slightly. In a quiet voice, he said, "If you can't practice it, then continue to practice. It is not so easy for a tree to grow." Chapter 640. Fan Xian stood under the large tree with one hand on his waist and the other gently patting the tree trunk. His mouth said it was forced, but there was a smile in his eyes. His appearance was as shameless as one could imagine. It was as if his entire body had been marked with many small squares. Each square had a large word written on it. This was the so-called cheap square. This young man from the Qing kingdom, in front of Sigurd not only did his words and actions offend, he even began to be cheap. The northern Qi emperor, who had been silently listening to their conversation and digesting the shock in her heart, tried to seize an opportunity. Seeing this scene, she could no longer resist. Looking at Fan Xian, she sighed and said, "How can a person be so shameless?" Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at her. With a self-mocking smile, he said, "You should know that I have learned Tianyi Dao. You should also know that I know the tyrannical martial method. If I also learn the Sigurd sword, although it is not a burden to have more skills, I always feel that I will become a strange creature. Furthermore, perhaps I will wipe out all possibilities in the future. Most importantly, I have never believed that there is love without reason or hate without reason in this world." He turned towards Sigurd in the wheelchair and quietly said, "You still haven't given up on the idea in your heart. Must those old fellows cultivate an opponent for my emperor before they die?" Sigurd expression was cold as he said, "Of the 3 of you, I didn't think highly of you in the past. Unexpectedly, you've changed a lot in these 2 years. You've improved a lot. It is beyond my expectations." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and replied, "After experiencing many life and death matters, one will always feel deeply moved." He knew that the 3 people Sigurd was referring to were him, Hai Tang, and 13th Wang, the 3 young people most likely to be close to the realm of a great grandmaster. He thought for a bit and then continued, 13th should have learned it before, but even he could not comprehend its true meaning, much less me. Sigurd didn't say anything. On the contrary, it was the northern Qi emperor who smiled slightly and said to Fan Xian, "If you really don't want to learn, why don't you give this opportunity to me?" "You?" Fan Xian laughed out loud. "The emperor is truly someone who does things differently." The little emperor pressed her thin lips together into a smile and said, "The sword saint just wants to make more trouble for the Qing emperor after he dies." You are, after all, his illegitimate child. I'm afraid you won't be able to harden your heart. Passing it to me seems more direct. Hearing these words, even Sigurd couldn't resist laughing hoarsely. Unexpectedly, there are more and more interesting people in the world. Alright, let's not talk about other people's business. Fan Xian stood seriously behind Sigurd. His hands gently rested on the back of the wheelchair. Since I want to learn, I have to hurry. Should I go bathe and fast for a few days? Sigurd's expression was strange. Turning his head to glance at him, he said, swords are used to kill. Even if you wash for 100 days, in the end, you will still be stained with blood. Why wash? Fan Xian shook his head and said, since you want to teach me, you have to act like a teacher. You should have learned most of the sword techniques from him. Sigurd narrowed his eyes slightly and coldly said, a sword is a dead object. What holds it is the hand. No matter which direction you stab or chop down from, no matter how many changes there are, it is impossible to exceed 10,000. In the end, space is only so big. Fan Xian listened silently and seriously. To the side, the little emperor also closed her eyes tightly, unwilling to let go of a single word of Sigurd's. Even if her realm was not enough for her to understand too much, forcefully memorizing it, there were still many talented aces in the northern Qi court, such as Haitang, who was far away on the grasslands. How can a sword stab out and kill someone? This is a problem with sword techniques. There is always a limit to the changes in sword techniques. In tens of thousands of years, who knows how many virtuous people of the past have put in hard work. As the saying goes, there is nothing new under the sun. No matter what kind of change there is, it has long been deduced by others. Thus, the sword technique has never been the most important part. Sigurd's remaining arm rested calmly on the armrest of the wheelchair. He slowly stroked it like he was stroking the hilt of an ancient sword. When you sense a certain realm, you should understand that what you need to consider with a murderous sword is not how to kill, but whether you should kill. It seemed to be a very profound statement, but Fan Xian understood it. Wu Zhu had once talked to Fan Xian about the so-called power. Power was the level of Jinqi cultivation in a person's body, but power contained too many things, such as an aura and specific techniques. Sword techniques, without question, had to be included in power. What Sigurd was talking about now had already surpassed the scope of power. It is the heart and the will. When your power has reached its peak, what you need to break through is the heart and the will, Sigurd said coldly. He then raised his head to gaze at the large tree above his head. In an instant, the sword intent in his eyes pierced the sky. The countless birds and insects in the big green tree sensitively felt the killing intent that filled the heaven and earth. They fled in panic and let out countless bird cries and insect cries. It was extremely mournful. The birds turned into countless black dots and flew out from the deep green canopy, heading straight for the clouds under the sky. They wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. Sigurd's voice grew lower and lower. A person is not a god. His physical body is a vessel. In the end, there is a limit. The cultivation of Jinqi and the increase of the real realm will stop when it reaches a certain stage, a stage where the body and meridians cannot hold it. If one continues to forcefully cultivate and increase it, it will only cause their meridians to break and they will become useless. Of course, rising another foot above the blue sea realm is already at the upper 9th level. If one wants to increase it further, it is a very difficult matter. Sigurd's eyes continued to gaze calmly at the green treetop. Fan Xian and the little emperor listened quietly to the side. The atmosphere was slightly strange. The little emperor was not a martial ace, so she did not understand. However, Fan Xian immediately captured the true meaning within. Regardless of whether it was Lang Tiao, Yunjilan, or himself, they had all entered the upper 9th level realm. However, they could no longer increase their cultivation because they had already reached the limits of the human body. No matter how much they cultivated, they could only maintain themselves in this realm. Reality is the water in a jar. The power is the way the water is sprinkled, Sigurd said slowly. Sigurd leisurely said, a jar of water will never be able to nourish 10,000 acres of fertile land. This is the so-called limit. If you cannot break through the boundaries of power, you can forever only sprinkle water one ladle at a time. You cannot change your pettiness. No matter how many sword techniques you learn, there is only so much of the source. Of course, you cannot experience the feeling of a river bursting its banks. Thus, the most important thing is still the Jinqi in the body, Fan Xian unconsciously replied. Fan Xian unconsciously followed up. He thought of the unfathomable way of the Emperor's Jinqi in the Emperor's body. Between realms, there is always a balance and mutual restriction. Reality is indeed the most important thing. If you cannot grasp a method to release the reality in your body, it is impossible for you to have an extraordinary reality. Just like if a river bursts its banks, if you cannot control the flow of the river water, the mysterious heavens will certainly not grant you a river. Sigurd smiled mockingly. The heavens have the virtue of cherishing life and will not let a person die so easily. This saying is too idealistic. Furthermore, I have suddenly realized that although you have raised the most warriors in the world, in terms of teaching students, you are actually about the same as Uncle Wu Zhu. Fan Xian sighed. He thought to himself that what Sigurd said was very reasonable. It was just nonsense. Without a method to control the Jinqi in the body, the self-restraint of the human body would not allow the Jinqi to expand limitlessly. If one could not increase the Jinqi beyond that critical point, it would be impossible to grasp such a mysterious method. It was truly nonsense. Furthermore, it was a proposition that did not make sense. Because the Jinqi in the body is no longer at a level that the human body can tolerate and has already left the boundaries of the mortal world, the method to control this kind of Jinqi should not be something that humans have. Sigurd pulled his gaze back from above and looked at Fan Xian coldly. This is a very natural principle. Then, how do you solve this problem? You must first find a method that does not belong to the mortal world. Perhaps it was because Sigurd had pulled his gaze back, but the wind on the tree had stopped. The leaves swayed gently. The young birds and bugs that had not been able to escape the tree in time sank into silence with the joy of escaping death. It is precisely the will and will I spoke of earlier. Sigurd looked into Fan Xian's eyes. He didn't know how much this young man could comprehend. Slowly, he said, extraordinary strength can only appear in this world through extraordinary methods. You have to forget everything you have ever learned. Little tricks, coffin breaker, Sigu sword, tyrannical methods, Tianyi Dao methods. You have to forget all of these methods that can capture traces. As long as there are traces, there must be a reason to follow. However, the true power of the great Grandmaster realm truly does not have any reason. The pupils in Sigurd eyes gradually constricted. Looking at Fan Xian, he said in a stern voice, you have to forget that you are a person. You have to forget that you have hands and feet. You have to forget the hair on your body and the soreness in your bones. Don't try to use any methods that your body can control to calm the Jinqi in your body. Only the will and will can cast aside the restrictions of the physical body. Sigurd voice gradually became lower, but it was like countless bells ringing in Fan Xian's heart. Take off your clothes. Taking off his clothes, Fan Xian's heart felt like it had been struck by lightning. Sweat suddenly seeped out of his body and completely soaked his clothes. He was familiar with these words because it was a passage from the records of old sayings, in the 5 classics. When Master Ku He's teacher, Master Genshin, was comprehending the way, he had once shouted, "The human body is the undershirt. Only by taking it off is the path of the way." On the precipice in Danzhou, at the most crucial moment of his cultivation of the tyrannical martial method, Uncle Wu Zhu had smashed his staff into his head and also shouted these words. Unexpectedly, he had heard these words again from Siga Jian's mouth. There seemed to be the will of heaven in the unseen world. It was also proving to Fan Xian the deep meaning of these words. It was as if it was showing him a completely new, mysterious, immeasurable, and charming realm. After this great Grandmaster Siga Jian finished speaking, he didn't speak again. He sat calmly and silently under the tree. Fan Xian's body was covered in cold sweat. He faintly knew he understood something, but in reality, he didn't understand anything. He knew what Siga Jian said was true and correct. However, this kind of method was too vague and indiscernible. There was no way to find it. Most importantly, such an idealistic way of speaking was completely different from the tyrannical martial method he had cultivated since he was a child. Without a person as a bridge, could he affect this real world with just his thoughts? What was different about man's existence in the world from all things? It was in the word thoughts. Man was the spirit of all things. He could speak and think. He could watch flowers bloom and feel joy. He could watch flowers fall and feel sorrow. He could watch the full and waning of the moon and feel the eternal vicissitudes of heaven and earth. He could watch the rise and fall of the tides and feel the impermanence of life. The old men with their heads bent in the yellow earth also knew the joy of shadow puppets. It was an instinctive pleasure to follow Pan Lang through the night. It could also affect one's thoughts in a way that left one's instincts or substance. A powerful official with unparalleled evil could sit in seclusion for half a day, write a painting, and be proud of himself for a long time. He was moved to tears. No creature was more complicated than humans. Only humans could have such rich emotions and thoughts that could not be forgotten in a moment. Heaven and earth were indifferent. Spectators lived and died. Only humans could look back at heaven and earth and faintly connect their thoughts. The sweat on Fan Xian's body gradually dried. He knew how admirable that realm was. He also knew that it was not a realm that could be reached just because he wanted to. He asked in a raspy voice, "The true Siga Jian does not need a sword. How will you teach me? This method cannot be passed on." "It's not that I don't want to pass it on. It's that I cannot pass it on." Siga Jian broke the silence and coldly said, "Today, you will wander with me through Dongyi. I can only let you see. As for how much you can experience, it will all depend on your luck." Fan Xian bowed sincerely and said, "I am willing to lead the way for you." The little emperor stood beside the two of them with her eyes closed. Her eyelids trembled anxiously. It looked like she was trying to memorize every word of their conversation. Siga Jian did not pay attention to what these two young people were thinking. He indicated for Fan Xian to push his wheelchair away from the tree and toward the bustling interior of Dongyi. At some point, perhaps it was the moment Siga Jian raised his head to look at the sky, the people under the tree had long scattered in all directions in fear. It was completely silent under the tree. There was only a faint shadow enveloping the ground under the tree. Chapter 641. When three people walk together, there will always be a teacher. Fan Xian and the little emperor pushed Siga Jian and quietly left the tree. Following the long straight path, they entered Dongyi's busiest street. The travelers who had been resting under the tree had long scattered in all directions in shock. Slowly, the scene they had seen earlier reached the ears of many people. Not many people had discovered who the cripple sitting on the wheel of the chair was. Siga Jian was Dongyi's god. Not many mortals had seen him before. The pedestrians on the street only felt that the combination of these three people was a little strange. Two very handsome young men were pushing a disabled person in a wheelchair. They didn't look like merchants who were here to buy or sell goods, nor did they look like tourists who came because of the fame. Fan Xian paid no attention to the gazes around him. He just quietly pushed the wheelchair. His gaze naturally fell on Siga Jian's shoulder. In the back of his head, he carefully thought back to the Grandmaster realm he had felt under the tree earlier. He was a person who loved to learn. When he had escorted Xiao En back to Northern Qi, he had not forgotten to ask Xiao En about court matters. Although there was an unspeakable grudge between him and Siga Jian, their relationship was incomparably complicated and subtle. Since this great Grandmaster was willing to reveal this realm to him and give him a chance to study it, he would not pass it up. Even though Siga Jian's action hid a dangerous murderous intent, Fan Xian still did not want to pass it up. Perhaps for just one day in Dongyi, he was willing to see Siga Jian as his true teacher. Of the three of them, only the Northern Qi Emperor's situation was awkward. She seemed to be Siga Jian's guest, but in reality, she was only a hostage in Fan Xian's hands. At this moment, she was purely a traveling companion. She was unable to understand the silent communication between Siga Jian and Fan Xian. She could only watch helplessly and say nothing. After leaving the tree, Siga Jian did not bring up those profound words again. Fan Xian also did not ask him seriously for guidance. It was as if the two of them had forgotten what they had talked about earlier and what they wanted to do. They only quietly and freely strolled through Dongyi, walking amidst the gazes and whispers of the people around them. Just as Siga Jian had said, there were many things that could only be understood and not conveyed. Since it was so, there was no benefit in saying more, so it was better not to say it. After walking for a while, perhaps Fan Xian noticed the little emperor's uneasiness. He glanced at her with a slight smile and quietly said something. A strained smile rose to the little emperor's cold face. Siga Jian took the two juniors to some old and run-down buildings. They were the places where the Yi family had made their fortune many years ago. Now, they had long been used for other purposes. The people who lived there would never have thought that the greatest merchant in the world had once lived in these rooms. Fan Xian knew what Siga Jian wanted to tell him and what he wanted to influence him, but he maintained his silence. It was not until they reached the Yi family's glass workshop that he quietly asked, "Later on, you became the protector of Dongyi. Why did Yi Qingmei, my mother, leave with Uncle Wu Zhu?" Fan Xian knew that period of history. After Yi Qingmei and Wu Zhu left Dongyi, they did not enter the surrounding vassal states. Instead, they found their way south of Dongyi and north of Danzhou. They found a path between the precipitous cliffs in that wild and primitive forest and went directly to Danzhou. That path was like a sheep's intestines and heavenly stairs. It was difficult to walk, but it was still a path. During the Dong Mountain incident 3 years ago, Yan Xiaoyi had used this path to sneak out and surround Dong Mountain with 5,000 soldiers. After the incident, regardless of whether it was the Qing Kingdom or Dongyi, they all invested boundless enthusiasm and caution into this secret path. Both sides placed heavy troops on both ends of the path. Fan Xian did not care about this path. He only cared about why Yi Qingmei had left Dongyi. By the seaside in Danzhou, Yi Qingmei had met the emperor, his father, and that old man, Chen Pingping. From then on, the glorious career of the Qing Kingdom's Gang of Four began. At that time, I had just taken over the city lord's manor. The sword hut had just opened. There was an uncontrollable anger in his cold words. Your mother's departure had nothing to do with whether or not I was powerful. It only had to do with whether or not Dongyi was powerful. She was ambitious. The thing she wanted to do had to rely on an even more powerful power in order to spread through the world. Sigurd turned his head and glanced at Fan Xian. In an icy voice, he said, in her opinion, Dongyi's power was not enough to support her thoughts. Fan Xian silently pushed the wheelchair. He understood what was going on. Since Yi Qingmei had chosen to enter the world in Dongyi because she pitied the suffering of the people, this idealistic woman who had once shone with boundless light would certainly think of a way to perfect this matter. Although Dongyi was located by the sea and had gathered all the wealth in the world, it was once a territory of the Wei Kingdom. Its position in the land was not very prominent. Most importantly, the people in Dongyi made their living as merchants. They were more than clever, but they were not very stubborn. If they wanted to create something big and use their own ideals to influence the entire world, Dongyi was, without question, not a good choice. Why didn't she go to Northern Qi? Yes, it was the Wei Kingdom. The Northern Qi Emperor, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly interjected, causing Fan Xian and Sigurd to glance at her at the same time. She sighed helplessly and said, "I can't be mute all day." The reason the little emperor couldn't resist asking this question was simple. Before hearing today's story, as the emperor of Northern Qi, she already had a deep understanding of the Yi family, once the foremost family in the world. She had a faint sense of admiration for that Yi woman. Later, after she took over the government, she worked hard to collude with the Qin Kingdom's Jiangnan Palace treasury. She knew just how much influence the palace treasury could have on a country. Thus, she was very regretful and curious as to why Yi Qingmei had not gone to the Wei Kingdom, which was now her own country. If she had gone, perhaps Fan Xian would have been born in Shangjing. Perhaps Northern Qi would not be as difficult as it was now. Of course, the biggest possibility was that Fan Xian would no longer exist in this world. Fan Xian smiled and explained in front of Sigurd Jian, back then, the Wei Kingdom controlled the entire land. It was the place where the feudal and decadent powers were most concentrated. Although it is said that a revolution should go to the most difficult place, in reality, it is not realistic. At that time, the Qin Kingdom had already been at war with Shihu for many years. The power of the country was beginning to show signs of youth. However, it was only in a corner and did not attract much attention. Additionally, the Qin people's personalities were open and unyielding, so they were more receptive to new things. Thus, it was not surprising that Mother chose the Qin Kingdom. After saying this, the little emperor furrowed her brows and shook her head unhappily. She thought to herself, what kind of nonsense is this? How come I clearly understand each word, but when put together, I don't know what he is talking about? Sigurd Jian glanced at Fan Xian and said, it was for this reason that she left Dongyi and went to the Qin Kingdom. She thought that the heir of the Qin Kingdom would obediently listen to her. When the Qin Kingdom unified the world, it would be the time she changed the world. Who would have thought that the heir would eventually become a true dragon in the world? How could he tolerate someone riding on his body? In the end, this great grandmaster could not suppress his laughter. There was a hint of joy in his laughter. Fan Xian was slightly angry in his heart. He stared at him coldly. Sigurd Jian did not care about his gaze at all. Coldly, he added, when I was young, I tasted countless joys and sorrows in the human world. I almost lost my life a number of times. Who knows how many of the servants and wet nurses who raised me died. Once I had power in my hands and my swordsmanship was beginning to form, when I entered the manor of the master of the city, I was determined to kill for revenge. However, I was stopped by your mother. Since your mother has left Dongyi and gone to the Qin Kingdom, I can kill as I please. Sigurd Jian lowered his head slightly. In one night, I massacred over 100 people in the manor. In one night, my aura was in chaos, and my realm began to form. Of course, after that matter, your mother and I broke off any correspondence. From then on, we were strangers. Sigurd gently patted the armrest of the wheelchair. His words were filled with sorrow, hatred, and sharpness. Fan Xian mockingly said, "Don't tell me that things are still so common. Don't tell me you are also one of my mother's admirers." Sigurd mockingly said, "No matter how beautiful she was or how capable she was, in my eyes, she was still that little girl under the tree. I have no interest in strange things. In this life, I only love the sword in my hand." Fan Xian could clearly feel the long-suppressed resentment in Sigurd chest. Perhaps it was a sense of loneliness after being abandoned. Perhaps it was because this great grandmaster saw Yi Qingmei's heart-wrenching end but was powerless to change anything. Sigurd had gone to the Qing royal palace 3 times with the intention of assassinating the Qing emperor. Because of the grandmaster race who never appeared in the royal palace, he had returned. He could not use his life as a gambling stake. His life represented the countless lives in Dongyi. Yet, he still went to the Qing kingdom. Just this proved his power. Why did Sigurd want to assassinate the Qing emperor? In the past, perhaps people thought that under the threat of the Qing kingdom, Dongyi was like a bird's nest in a storm and could be destroyed at any moment. Thus, this great grandmaster who used the sword tried to use his powerful martial power to change the course of history. After hearing so many stories and seeing so many of the marks Yi Qingmei had left in Dongyi, a different thought suddenly welled up in Fan Xian's heart. Perhaps Sigurd wanted to assassinate the Qing emperor because he was angry at the Qing emperor for not protecting Yi Qingmei. The 3 of them gradually became silent again. It was impossible for Fan Xian to express his gratitude to Sigurd for assassinating the emperor. The little emperor also could not say to himself that he had a good time today. Sigurd expression also became stern. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. The 2 of them didn't disturb him. The wheelchair rolled along the streets of Dongyi. The creaking was crisp and clear. It was as if it could travel along the long streets all the way to the harbor at the end. It could even travel to the ships and then be taken to other unfamiliar places in this world. Fan Xian suddenly raised his head. A clear light appeared in his eyes as he scanned his surroundings. What startled him from his thoughts was the clear and terrifying creaking sound beneath him. It was daytime. In his observations 2 days ago, it should be the busiest time in Dongyi. Merchants selling goods, travelers from afar, and sightseeing guests would all crowd here and make a racket. Why was it so quiet now? Even the creaking of the wheelchair could travel so far. He looked at the scene in front of him and took a deep breath. His face was slightly pale. His heart was filled with shock. The expression of the Northern Qi Emperor, who was pushing the wheelchair beside him, also changed slightly. Although she had seen such a scene countless times in her life, suddenly seeing it today still made her feel indescribably shocked. There was not a single person on the street. There wasn't even a scrap of paper. There were only green stone slabs, pieced together into the distance. All of the merchants and travelers were squeezed under the eaves on the 2 sides of the street. They knelt on the ground and bowed toward the center of the clean street, not moving at all. The little emperor knew that these foreign people were not bowing to her. They could only be bowing to the great grandmaster in the wheelchair. She couldn't resist looking at Sigurd shoulder with a questioning gaze. Only now did she know that Sigurd position in the hearts of the Dongyi people was even higher than that of an emperor. There were no soldiers to suppress them or open up a path. Everyone prostrated to the ground and bowed towards Sigurd in the wheelchair. It was like they were looking at the god in their hearts as they slowly walked toward the end of the street. Everyone in the world knew that this great grandmaster was about to die. Not many people in Dongyi had seen this great grandmaster's true face. During these 2 years, they still couldn't help but feel terrified and uneasy. Particularly now that they had truly seen the great grandmaster in the wheelchair, endless sorrow grew in the hearts of the Dongyi people. They knew that it was this crippled person in the wheelchair who had used the sword in his hand to protect their wealth, their freedom, and the decades of peace in their homes. A sense of shame even grew in their hearts. They felt that it was shameful to live under the protection of the Sword Saint for so many years. The Sword Saint was tired and old. A god gradually grew old and would eventually die. Just like the sun across the street, there would be a moment when it would sink into endless darkness. It looked like the moment under the tree had finally spread and startled all of the people in Dongi. They knew that the Sword Saint had finally come out of the hut and had come among them. That was why they were prostrating on the ground and feeling sorrow in their hearts. They were making this final farewell to express their gratitude. Fan Xian looked at this scene and felt a strange doubt in his heart. How did these people know that the person in the wheelchair was Siga Jian? There was no time to think. He had already sensed the powerful aura emanating from Siga Jian's small body. It was an aura that pushed people thousands of li away. It was an aura of absolute coldness. It was a completely different aura from the tens of thousands of people prostrating on the sides of the long street. Fan Xian was silent. He knew that this great grandmaster was giving him a second lesson. He didn't use words, only his actions. He used the shocking and sorrowful scene on the long street to tell him that in order to enter the realm of a great grandmaster, he not only had to take off his clothes, but he also had to abandon his emotions. It was not that he was heartless. Siga Jian's feelings for this large city were probably already very deep, which was why he appeared so cold and heartless. He was somewhat dismissive of the emotions the people of the secular world poured into him. Emotions are very precious things, but they are also very cheap things, Siga Jian said for the first time on the long street. These were Siga Jian's first words on the long street. If you have feelings for something, then you cannot be controlled by this feeling. And this is your mother's biggest problem. Fan Xian and the little emperor were deep in thought as they pushed the wheelchair forward under the worshipful gazes of tens of thousands of people. The creaking of the wheelchair grew louder and more ear-piercing. Then, the wheelchair stopped in front of a beautiful building. It was the manor of the master of the city that Fan Xian had come to yesterday. What are we doing here? Fan Xian asked respectfully. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.